A billionaire handed $1 million violin to the poorest woman in the room and dared her to prove she deserved to be his wife. Nobody believed she could do it. Nobody thought she'd even try. And nobody, not even Nathan Holloway himself, was prepared for what happened the moment that bow touched the strings. If you've ever been underestimated, ever had to swallow your pain and keep walking, this story is for you. Hit like, drop your city in the comments, and stay until the very end, because this is one journey you won't want to miss a single second of. The champagne was already cold before Clara Brooks even touched it. She'd been carrying trays for 6 hours straight, heels blistering inside shoes that were half a size too small, her black uniform damp at the collar from the kitchen heat, her hair pinned so tight at the back of her skull that a low-grade headache had been building since 7 o'clock. The Holloway estate was the kind of place that made working people feel invisible, which was usually fine by Clara. Invisible was exactly what she preferred. The ballroom of Holloway Manor stretched 3 stories high, its ceiling draped in cascading ivory fabric and threaded with thousands of warm lights that made everything look like the inside of a dream, or a very expensive nightmare, depending on where you were standing. If you were standing near the bar with a glass of Krug in your hand and diamonds at your throat, it was probably the former. If you were standing near the kitchen entrance with a tray of those same glasses and blisters on your feet, it was definitely the latter. Clara was 30 years old, and she had learned, over the years, to move through spaces like this one without making eye contact, without making sound, without making any impression at all. She had a gift for disappearing in plain sight. It had kept her employed. It had kept her safe. It had kept her from having to answer certain questions about herself that she wasn't ready to answer. She picked up a fresh tray from the kitchen pass-through, squared her shoulders, and walked back into the light. The party was in full swing. Nathan Holloway's 32nd birthday, as announced by the gold-embossed invitations that had apparently circulated across 3 states, was not so much a celebration as it was a demonstration of wealth, of influence, of the particular kind of social gravity that pulls people into orbit around one man and keeps them there, smiling, whether they want to be or not. Clara had heard about Nathan Holloway the way most people hear about landmarks, through other people, through the background noise of a city that couldn't stop talking about him. He'd inherited a mid-size real estate firm at 24 after his father's death, then spent the next 8 years doing something nobody had expected. He made it enormous. Not through luck, not through inherited connections, but through a combination of relentless work and a particular kind of cold, precise intelligence that people who worked for him described with a mixture of respect and wariness. He had turned vacant lots into skylines. He had bought bankrupt hotels and turned them into the kind of places that made architecture magazines. He had done all of it while raising a daughter alone after his wife, Elaine, died of a brain aneurysm when their little girl was 18 months old. People in this city talked about Nathan Holloway's grief the same way they talked about his money, with a kind of reverent distance, as though it were too large a thing to approach directly. Clara didn't think about any of that. She thought about getting through the next 2 hours without spilling anything. She moved along the edge of the room, offering champagne to guests who barely glanced at her. A senator's wife took a glass without breaking eye contact with the woman she was talking to. A venture capitalist in a midnight blue tuxedo waved her away like she was a slow fly. Clara kept moving, keep smiling at the floor, get through the night, go home. She was circling back toward the far side of the room when she saw him for the first time. Nathan Holloway was standing near the grand fireplace, a glass in his hand that she could tell he hadn't really been drinking from. It was still too full, the condensation too minimal. He was taller than she'd imagined from the photographs she'd seen on the estate's internal notice boards, and darker in coloring. Black hair with the first faint threads of silver at the temples. Dark eyes that were doing what Clara recognized immediately as the thing people do at parties they don't entirely want to be at. They were present, they were polite, they were somewhere else. He was handsome in the way that certain men are handsome when they're not trying to be. A little rough at the jaw, a little tired around the eyes. Not the polished kind of handsome that sits in a room like a piece of furniture, the kind that shifts and changes depending on the light, the kind that's more interesting the longer you look at it. Clara didn't look long. She looked away, kept moving, and that might have been the end of it. One more night in a long string of nights that she would not remember. except for what happened next. The woman's name, Clara would later learn, was Veronica Ashworth. She was 35, the daughter of a hedge fund manager, and she had been attached to Nathan's social circle for the better part of 2 years in a capacity that seemed deliberately ambiguous. She was beautiful in a way that required effort and money, and made sure you knew it. She wore a red dress that evening that cost more than Clara made in 4 months, and she wore it with the particular confidence of someone who expected the room to organize itself around her. She was mid-sentence, mid-laugh, mid-gesture, when she stepped backward directly into Clara's path. The tray tilted. Clara's wrist compensated. She'd been doing this long enough that her body reacted before her brain did. But it wasn't enough. 2 glasses went sideways. The champagne caught the air in a brief glittering arc before it landed squarely on the left side of Veronica Ashworth's red dress, running down from her shoulder to her hip in a cold, fizzing streak. The conversation around them stopped. Not all at once. It rippled outward in a wave of sudden silence, people turning, glasses pausing halfway to lips. Veronica went very still. Then she turned slowly, and the expression on her face was not anger exactly. It was something more controlled than anger. It was the particular expression of a person who has decided how this is going to go and is already several steps ahead. "You," she started. "I'm so sorry," Clara said immediately. She was already reaching for the cloth at her waist, already moving to help, her voice low and direct. "I'm so sorry. It was completely my fault. Let me—" "Don't touch me." Veronica's voice was quiet and absolute. Clara stopped. She stood with the cloth in her hand and the empty tray at her side, and felt the weight of every set of eyes in the immediate vicinity bearing down on her. "Do you have any idea what this dress cost?" Veronica said. "I'll take care of the dry cleaning, of course, and any—" "Dry cleaning," Veronica laughed, a short, incredulous sound. "This is a Valentino, darling. It doesn't get dry cleaned, it gets destroyed." She looked at Clara with open contempt. "Can you even afford to replace it?" The honest answer was no. The honest answer was that Clara's entire month's salary might cover 1/3 of what that dress cost, if she was lucky. She said nothing. "That's what I thought," Veronica said. It was around this moment that Nathan Holloway crossed the room. Clara noticed him coming the way you notice a change in air pressure. Something shifted in the crowd, a small parting, the energy of the room adjusting slightly. He moved without urgency, his hands relaxed at his sides, his face giving nothing away. He stopped about 3 feet from where Clara was standing and looked at the situation with the calm, assessing expression of someone who is used to problems presenting themselves and expecting him to solve them. "Everything all right?" he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected, even and measured, but not warm exactly, not cold either, just level. "Your staff," Veronica said, "just ruined an irreplaceable garment." "It was an accident," Clara said, and immediately regretted speaking because now his eyes moved to her, and she found she did not entirely know what to do with the quality of his attention. It was thorough without being rude. It landed on her the way very few people's attention did, as though she were actually there. "Of course it was an accident," he said, and for 1 second Clara thought that was going to be the end of it. A graceful defuse. Everyone moves on, but then something happened that she didn't understand until later, when she had more context for who Nathan Holloway was and what that night meant to him. Later, she would wonder if he'd had too little sleep or too much to drink, or if the weight of another birthday without Elaine had done something strange to his judgment. She would never know for certain. What she knew was this: he looked at her, really looked at her, and said something that no one in that ballroom expected. "You're Clara Brooks, aren't you?" he said. "You've been on the staff here for, what, 3 months?" "4, she said carefully. He nodded slowly. "My daughter talks about you." This was news to Clara. She'd exchanged maybe 8 words total with Lily Holloway, a quiet 6-year-old with her father's dark eyes who sometimes wandered into the wrong wing of the house and watched the kitchen staff work from a careful distance, as though she were studying them. "She says you hum when you clean the east hallway." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile. "She says it sounds like classical music." Clara said nothing. The back of her neck was hot. And then And this was the part she would replay in her mind for weeks afterward, trying to understand it. Nathan Holloway turned and walked to the far wall, where a glass cabinet stood between two tall windows. He took a key from his jacket pocket, unlocked it, and removed something that made the people nearest to him go quiet in a different way than before. Not the silence of spectacle, the silence of recognition. It was a violin. Not just any violin. Even from a distance, even to someone who had spent years trying not to think about such things, Clara could see the age and the quality of it. The amber depth of the varnish, the proportions that were slightly different from a modern instrument, the particular way the light moved across its curves. It was old. It was extraordinary. And the way Nathan Holloway held it, carefully, but not like someone who played. Like someone who had learned to carry something precious without understanding what it was, told her everything about where it had come from and what it meant to him. He walked back across the room and held it out to her. The silence was complete now. Someone near the bar had stopped mid-sentence with their mouth still open. "My mother was a violinist," Nathan said. "She believed that music was the most honest thing a person could offer, that you can tell everything about a person by how they play." He kept his eyes on Clara's face. "So I'll make you a deal." Clara's voice came out steady, which surprised her. "What kind of deal?" "Play something." He nodded toward the violin in his hands. "If you can make this room feel something real, not polite, not impressed, real, I'll personally cover whatever damage was done tonight. Every cent. And I'll make sure Veronica understands it was not your fault." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Not all of it mean, but most of it. The kind of laughter that comes from the certainty that what's happening is absurd, that the outcome is already obvious, that this is going to be entertaining precisely because it's going to be terrible. "And if I can't?" Clara said. He looked at her evenly. "Then you can't. And we'll handle it some other way." Veronica made a sound of amused disbelief. "Nathan, for heaven's sake!" "And," he said, and here his voice changed slightly, dropping half a register, taking on a quality that silenced Veronica mid-breath. "If you play it the way I think you might be able to play it, if you play it the way my mother would have wanted someone to play it, I'll give you something worth considerably more than an apology." Someone near the front whispered something. Clara couldn't hear what. "What are you offering?" she asked. He said it simply, without drama, which made it stranger than if he'd been theatrical about it. "Marry me." The laughter that followed was loud, genuine, even, the kind that fills a room without restraint, the kind that has nothing to do with cruelty but is cruelty anyway, because of what it assumes. It assumed that this was funny. It assumed that the outcome was obvious. It assumed that the woman standing there with an empty tray and a half-size too small shoes and champagne on her fingers was not the kind of person who could do what was being asked, had never been the kind of person who could do it, and never would be. Clara let the laughter go on for a moment. She set her tray down on the nearest surface, a small side table with a bronze lamp on it. She took the violin from Nathan Holloway's hands. She didn't look at the room. She didn't look at Veronica, whose expression had shifted from amusement to something sharper and harder to name. She didn't look at Nathan, whose face had gone very still in a way that might have been curiosity or might have been something else entirely. She looked at the violin. Her hands knew it before her mind caught up. The weight of it, the specific balance point, the way the chin rest settled, all of it fed back to something in her muscle memory that she had spent years carefully burying. Her left hand found the neck. Her right hand took the bow from where Nathan had been holding it loosely at his side, which was where she'd known it would be. She tightened the bow hair a quarter turn from where it sat. It needed more rosin. She could feel the slight resistance, but it would do. She brought the instrument to her shoulder. The laughter in the room died. Not dramatically, not all at once. It tapered off the way sound does when something new enters a space and makes everything else irrelevant. People stopped talking not because they decided to, but because they simply forgot to keep going. Clara closed her eyes for 1 second. She thought about her father. She thought about a practice room with bad fluorescent lighting and a radiator that knocked. She thought about the morning she was 12 years old, and her teacher, a severe Hungarian woman named Mrs. Vasarhelyi, had grabbed her wrist after a lesson and said, not kindly, but with complete conviction, "You have it. I've taught for 30 years and you have it. Don't you dare waste it." She opened her eyes, and she played. She chose the chaconne, Bach's Partita No. 2 in D minor, the chaconne. Not because it was showy, because it was true, because it was the piece that Mrs. Wasserhey had called the greatest piece of music ever written for a solo instrument, and because it was the piece Clara had played the night before her father died, in the small living room of their apartment in Queens, with the window open and the street noise coming in, and her father sitting in his armchair with his eyes closed and a small private smile on his face that she had spent 15 years trying to forget because she could not look at it without the ground going out from under her. The first note hit the air of the Holloway ballroom like a stone hitting still water. The second note spread from it. By the third, something was happening in the room that had nothing to do with spectacle and everything to do with what Mrs. Wasserhey had been talking about all those years ago. The thing you could not fake. The thing that was either there or it wasn't. The thing that made people in concert halls lean forward in their seats without knowing they were doing it, that made a sound enter through the ears and arrive somewhere behind the sternum, somewhere biological and involuntary, somewhere that had nothing to do with taste or education or how much your dress cost. Clara played. She played the way she had not allowed herself to play in 11 years, without holding anything back, without managing it or moderating it or making it presentable. She let it be what it was: grief and beauty and rage and love, and the specific devastating beauty of music that has been written by someone who understood that life is full of loss and wrote about it anyway, without flinching, without comfort, with absolute and ruthless clarity. Around her, the ballroom did things she wasn't watching. Women whose expressions had been fixed in social pleasantry felt something move in their chests and didn't know what to do with it. A man near the window turned away and stared at the dark glass. Veronica Ashworth stood with her arms crossed and her jaw tight, and her eyes doing something she would have denied if you'd pointed it out. The senator's wife, who had not looked at Clara once all evening, stood completely still with a champagne glass forgotten in her hand, and Nathan Holloway stood where he'd been standing when he handed her the violin, and did not move, and did not look away. His mother had loved Bach. Margaret Holloway had loved this piece specifically. He remembered that now with a force that surprised him, a memory surfacing from somewhere deep and specific. Being 10 years old, sitting at the top of the stairs in this very house, listening to his mother practice in the music room below, this exact piece, the notes rising through the floorboards, filling the walls. He remembered falling asleep to it once. He remembered the way the house had felt different when she played. Larger, somehow, more real. His mother had been dead for 9 years. He had not opened that cabinet in 2 of them. He stood in the ballroom of his own house and listened to a woman he had underestimated play his dead mother's violin with a precision and a depth of feeling that made the floor feel temporarily uncertain beneath him. And he understood, in the way you understand things that come from outside your plans and your control, that something had just changed. He didn't know what yet. He just knew it had. Clara played for 4 minutes and 20 seconds. She knew the exact duration because she had timed it years ago, knew this passage by heart in a way that lived below language, below thought. When she reached the end of the section she had chosen, she brought the bow off the strings cleanly, let the last note dissolve into the air of the room, and lowered the instrument. The silence lasted long enough that it became its own kind of sound. Then someone began to applaud. Then someone else. Then the room, in a ragged, genuine, unpolished rush that was entirely unlike the practiced social applause that had greeted the other entertainment earlier in the evening. This was different. This was people clapping because their hands had decided to before their brains caught up. Clara lowered the violin from her shoulder. Her face was composed, but her hands, if you'd been close enough and paying attention, were not quite steady. She held the violin carefully, reverently, though she would not have used that word, and turned to Nathan Holloway. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read, not the social mask from before. Something more unguarded than that, something that looked briefly like a man who has been caught off guard by his own feelings and hasn't yet decided what to do about it. "That was my mother's favorite piece," he said. His voice was level but slightly rougher than before. "I know what it is," she said. "I've known it since I was 9. A pause. "Where did you train?" She looked at him steadily. "Juilliard," Something moved through the crowd at that. A murmur, a recalibration. "And after?" he asked. "After," she said carefully, "I stopped." He didn't push it. Something in his face said he understood that there were things people stopped doing for reasons that didn't fit neatly into conversation, and that pressing on those reasons in a room full of people was not something he was going to do. Veronica Ashworth chose this moment to reassert herself. She laughed, a controlled, practiced sound. "Well, very impressive, but I think we can all agree that a party trick is not exactly—" "I made a deal," Nathan said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look at Veronica. Veronica went quiet. He looked at Clara. "I made a deal." Clara looked back at him. In the years that followed, she would remember this moment with a kind of bewildered clarity. The moment before everything changed, when she could still have handed the violin back and walked to the kitchen and finished her shift and gone home and kept her life exactly as small and safe as she'd built it to be. "You weren't serious," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "I was entirely serious." He didn't say it like a man making a declaration. He said it like someone stating a fact that has surprised him slightly, but that he intends to stand behind. "Though I understand if you aren't." Around them, the room had shifted into a different kind of silence. The laughter was gone. In its place was something more complicated. The particular attention of a crowd that has witnessed something it didn't expect and is now watching to see what comes next, pulled forward against its own sophistication, unable to look away. Clara held his mother's violin in her hands. She thought about her apartment in Brooklyn, the radiator that didn't work properly, the second job she took 3 evenings a week to make rent, the way she'd learned to fold herself smaller and smaller over the years until she took up almost no space at all. She thought about her father's photograph on her nightstand, the one from a Sunday afternoon in the park, him squinting into the sun with a hot dog in his hand, laughing at something off camera, and the way she still talked to it sometimes when things were bad, which was a habit she was slightly embarrassed by and had no intention of stopping. She thought about the violin under her chin 4 minutes ago and the way it had felt to stop holding it back. "I need to finish my shift," she said. It was not the answer anyone in the room was expecting. Veronica made a strangled sound. Several guests exchanged glances. Nathan Holloway blinked once, slowly, and then, for the first time all evening in a way that changed the whole architecture of his face, he almost smiled. "Of course," he said. Clara handed the violin back to him carefully, making sure his hands were fully around it before she released her own. She picked up her tray from the side table. She smoothed her uniform with her free hand. "I'll find you before I leave," she said, and walked back toward the kitchen. She made it through the kitchen door before her hands started shaking. She stood with her back against the cold stainless steel prep counter and breathed slowly in and out while the kitchen noise swirled around her. The clatter of plates, the hiss of the dishwasher, the murmur of the other staff who had no idea what had just happened 30 feet away. Her hands shook for about 45 seconds. Then they stopped. She picked up a fresh tray. She went back to work. The rest of the evening passed in a strange, muffled quality, like sounds through water. Guests looked at her differently. Not all of them, and not in ways she could have pinned down exactly, but she could feel the shift in the room's atmosphere, the way certain people's eyes tracked her now as she moved through the ballroom. She ignored it. She'd learned to ignore being looked at. It was being invisible that required the real skill. She found Nathan Holloway at 20 minutes past midnight, when the party had begun to thin, and the catering supervisor had signaled that the staff could begin breaking down the service areas. He was standing near the now-closed violin cabinet, speaking quietly with a man she didn't recognize, and he ended the conversation when he saw her approaching. The other man made himself scarce with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent years reading Nathan Holloway's signals. "You came back," Nathan said. "I said I would." He looked at her for a moment. Up close, in the quieter light of the thinning party, she could see things she hadn't before. The tiredness around his eyes that wasn't just tonight, but was accumulated, built up over time. The particular set of a person who carries something heavy and has been carrying it long enough that they've stopped noticing the weight most of the time. "I meant what I said," he told her. "I know you did." She held his gaze. "But you should know that I'm not interested in being a gesture." Something sharpened in his expression. "What does that mean?" It means that what you did tonight, whatever it was, whatever impulse it came from, I'm not interested in being someone's atonement or someone's novelty or someone's point proven. She kept her voice even. I don't know you, you don't know me, and a public offer made in front of 200 people at your birthday party is not a foundation for anything. He was quiet for a moment. That's fair, he said. I know it is. Another silence. The party continued to drain around them, glasses being collected, music lowering, the particular deflation of an evening ending. My daughter is 7 in February, he said, which was not a response to anything she'd said and which surprised her enough that she didn't immediately have a reply. She's been waking up at 3 in the morning lately. She won't tell me why. She just comes and finds me and sits on the end of my bed until she falls back asleep. He looked at the cabinet. I don't know if it's normal or if I'm doing something wrong. Clara considered this. What does her pediatrician say? That she's fine, developmentally on track, that kids go through phases. Then she's probably fine. Probably, he agreed. He looked back at Clara. She's going to ask about tonight. I'm going to have to explain it. What are you going to tell her? He thought about it. That I heard something real for the first time in a long time, and I made a fool of myself over it. Clara almost smiled. That's honest. I'm trying. He paused. Would you be willing to have coffee? Not here. Not like this. Just somewhere ordinary. So I can apologize properly and you can tell me about Juilliard and I can pretend I didn't just propose marriage to someone I've known for 4 minutes. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the violin under her chin, the way the wood had vibrated against her jaw, the way the sound had moved through her body, the way she'd felt for 4 minutes and 20 seconds, like herself, the real self, the one she'd been carefully boxing away for 11 years. I work Tuesdays, she said. I'm free Thursday morning. He nodded. Thursday. She picked up her coat from the staff room, caught the last subway home, and was asleep by 2:30 in the morning. She did not think about Nathan Holloway's almost smile, or his dead mother's violin, or the particular quality of the silence in that ballroom when the last note dissolved into the air. She almost convinced herself she wasn't thinking about it. She was still almost convincing herself when the alarm went off at 7. Well, the city was wet by morning, the pavement slick and dark, the street outside her building reflecting headlights in long, wobbly streaks. Clara made coffee in her small kitchen, stood at the window with the mug in both hands, and looked down at the sidewalk where her neighbors were already moving. A woman in scrubs pulling a rolling bag, a man walking a large indifferent dog, 2 kids in school uniforms arguing about something with enough energy to generate their own weather system. Her apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that was old enough to have character and not yet old enough to have been renovated into something impersonal. The walls were thin. She could hear the family upstairs moving around in the mornings, the particular rhythm of their life filtering through the ceiling like music through a floor. She'd stopped minding it years ago. Sometimes it was even a comfort. There was a bookshelf along the east wall that held, among other things, 3 years of used accounting textbooks from the night classes she'd taken and never finished, a collection of paperback novels with broken spines, a row of CDs that she no longer had a player for but kept anyway, and one thing she never moved and never talked about. A photograph, in a plain wooden frame of her father. He was 44 in the photograph, squinting into afternoon sun, hot dog in hand, laughing at something out of frame. It was a Sunday in the park. She had been behind the camera, 18 years old, just back from her first summer at a music festival in Vermont, still buzzing with everything she was going to do and everywhere she was going to be. Her father had made a bad joke about mustard. She'd laughed and taken the picture. 2 years later, he was gone. Car accident. February. Black ice on the bridge. The kind of death that happens in one specific moment and changes every moment afterward. She'd been at Juilliard when she got the call. She'd played her last performance 4 days before, at a student showcase, Bartok, to a small audience that had applauded the way you applaud when you're witnessing something and you know you're witnessing something, even if you can't quite say what it is. Her teacher had pulled her aside afterward and used the word prodigy, which Clara had deflected because it always made her uncomfortable, and which she now understood was simply true. She had flown home for the funeral. She had not gone back. She had not played again. Not seriously, not the way she'd played last night. She looked at the photograph. Yeah, she said. I know. She finished her coffee, rinsed the mug, and got ready for work. She did not allow herself to think about Thursday. She thought about it constantly. Thursday came the way things come when you've been trying not to think about them. Faster than expected and with less ceremony than you'd built up in your head. Clara wore the same coat she always wore because it was the only one she had that didn't look tired. Dark gray wool, slightly too big at the shoulders from the years when she'd bought it secondhand and been optimistic about filling it out. She took the subway to the coffee shop Nathan had texted her the address of, a place called Denny's Corner on West 74th. Not glamorous, not a statement, just a narrow room with good light and tables that had seen better decades. She was 7 minutes early. She ordered a plain coffee and sat with her hands around the mug and told herself this was not a big deal. He was 4 minutes late, which she'd been half expecting. Men like Nathan Holloway, she'd assumed, ran on the kind of schedule that bent slightly around their own convenience. But when he came through the door, he was the one who looked caught off guard. Hair not quite settled, jacket slightly rushed. The particular expression of someone who'd been in a meeting that ran long and had made a decision to leave it anyway. He saw her, crossed the room, and sat down across from her without any of the social preamble she'd been braced for. Sorry, he said. My 11 o'clock didn't get the memo about ending at 11. It's fine. She watched him flag down a server, order a black coffee, and pull his jacket off in one unselfconscious motion. He wasn't performing anything. That was the first thing she noticed, that he was not performing being a billionaire having coffee with a maid the way she'd half expected him to. He was just a tired man in a coffee shop on a Thursday morning who'd been late and knew it. I wasn't sure you'd come, he said. I said I would. You also said you weren't interested in being a gesture. He looked at her directly. I've been thinking about that since Saturday. And you were right to say it. He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug when it arrived, the same way she was holding hers, which she noticed and didn't comment on. What I did was, I don't know what it was, entirely. I've been trying to figure it out. Take your time, Clara said, which came out drier than she intended. He almost smiled. It wasn't meant as a joke, he said. I want to be clear about that. I know it looked like one. It looked like a man at his own birthday party who'd had enough champagne to make a dramatic gesture in front of 200 people. I hadn't had that much champagne. Then it looked like a man who does dramatic things without champagne, which is arguably worse. He was quiet for a second, and then he laughed. A short, genuine sound that was nothing like the polished social performance she'd seen fragments of at the party. It was the laugh of someone who actually found something funny. It changed his face completely, and she noted this the way she noted most things, carefully and without letting it show. That's fair, he said. That's accurate. She let the moment settle before she said anything else. Outside, the Thursday traffic moved past the window in its usual indifferent stream. Someone at the next table was eating a croissant with an intensity that suggested they'd skipped breakfast. The coffee was good, stronger than she usually made it herself, with a slight bitterness that she liked. Your mother played violin, she said. How long had it been since someone played that instrument? Something shifted in his face. He looked at his mug. 2 years, maybe 2.5. Who played it before? My mother. She died 9 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, fairly fast. He said it with the directness of someone who's delivered this information enough times that the saying of it no longer does what it used to do, even if the fact of it still does. She played until about 6 months before she died. Then her hands started. She lost some dexterity. She stopped. She never played again after that. Clara nodded. She didn't say she was sorry. He looked like a man who had heard that a sufficient number of times. Why did you keep the violin in the cabinet? She asked. He turned the mug slightly in his hands. Because I couldn't figure out what else to do with it. Donating it felt wrong. Selling it was obviously not happening. Leaving it out felt, I don't know, exposing it to something. To being seen. He looked at her. Yeah, exactly. The conversation opened from there the way conversations do when both people have stopped pretending they're somewhere they don't want to be. He asked about Juilliard, and she told him, carefully, selectively, the way you tell someone about a part of your life that still has some live wiring in it. She told him about arriving at 17 from Queens with a scholarship and a single suitcase and the absolute conviction that she knew what her life was going to look like. She told him about her teacher, Mrs. Vasarhelyi, who had been 72 years old and Hungarian and had operated under the professional philosophy that if you weren't bleeding from the effort, you weren't trying hard enough. She told him about the first time she'd played in the recital hall, the specific quality of the silence before the first note, the way it seemed to have weight, the way she'd learned to use it. She did not tell him about her father. Not yet. He told her about his daughter. Lily was 6. Clara had been told 7 in February, which was still almost 3 months away. And she was, Nathan said, the most serious person he had ever encountered in his life, including in professional settings. She had opinions about things. Strong, reasoned, slightly unnerving opinions, delivered in a small, clear voice that she'd apparently inherited from her mother. She liked building things with her hands. She liked the upstairs library. She'd recently decided that she wanted to learn chess, and Nathan had bought her a board and a beginner's book, and she had spent one weekend reading the book cover to cover before informing him that the author's explanation of the Sicilian defense was, quote, not very clear. She's 6, Claire said. I know. He looked genuinely baffled by it in a way that was clearly ongoing. I don't know where she gets it. My wife was very sharp, very direct, but Lily took that and added something her own. What was her mother like? Clara asked, and then immediately reconsidered. You don't have to. No, it's fine. He set his mug down. She was funny. Dark sense of humor, very dry. She could make you feel like the smartest person in the room and then turn around and say something that made you realize she'd been 3 steps ahead the whole time. He paused. She was 31 when she died. Lily was 18 months. She never got to know her. Clara said nothing. Sometimes there was nothing to say that wasn't just noise. Lily asks about her, Nathan continued. Not all the time, but regularly. She has photographs in her room. She talks to them sometimes. He stopped as though he hadn't meant to say that last part and looked briefly uncomfortable. Sorry, my father has been dead for 11 years, Claire said. I still talk to his photograph. He looked at her. It's not strange, she said. It's just what people do. The silence between them was different after that. Not the careful, assessed silence of strangers, but something more like the silence between people who have accidentally shown each other something real and are deciding whether to be embarrassed about it. He was not the man she'd expected. That was the problem, or not the problem. The complication. She'd expected someone who'd assembled himself entirely, who had no loose parts, who existed at a remove from ordinary human experience, and was fine with that. Instead, she was sitting across from someone who didn't know why his daughter woke at 3 a.m, who kept his dead mother's violin locked in a cabinet because he didn't know what else to do with it, who had made a completely unhinged proposal to a stranger at his own birthday party and was now trying to figure out what he'd actually meant by it. He was a mess in ways that were specific and recognizable, and nothing like the caricature of wealth and control she'd been prepared for. This, she told herself firmly, was not necessarily a reason to do anything. They stayed at Denny's Corner for 2.5 hours. She was late for her shift at the second job, a cafe near the Barclays Center where she picked up 3 evening shifts a week, and she had to leave abruptly, gathering her coat and her bag and apologizing. And he stood when she stood, which was a small thing and an old-fashioned thing, and she noticed it anyway. Can I, he started. Thursday next week, she said. Same time. He sat back down. Same time, he agreed. She was halfway out the door before she heard him say, quietly, to no one in particular, or possibly to himself. She plays Bach like she's having an argument with it. She kept walking. She was smiling before she hit the sidewalk, which she told herself was involuntary and didn't count. The weeks that followed moved in a rhythm that Clara hadn't anticipated and didn't know what to do with. Thursdays at Denny's Corner, then Thursdays became occasional evenings when Lily was with Nathan's housekeeper. Then an afternoon at the estate when Clara was between shifts and Nathan had wanted to show her something in the library that she still wasn't entirely sure was a pretext or not. It probably was. She didn't especially mind. She found herself thinking about things she hadn't thought about in years. Not just the music, though that was part of it. The reawakening of something she'd worked to keep quiet was its own complicated process, like sensation coming back to a limb that's been asleep too long, part relief and part something close to pain. She thought about what it meant to want something again. She thought about whether wanting was the same as allowing yourself to want it, and whether there was a version of this, of Nathan, of Lily, of whatever was assembling itself between them, that she could inhabit without losing the careful architecture of the life she'd built around her own survival. She was not a person who had been waiting to be rescued. She needed to be clear about that, at least to herself. The life she had in Brooklyn, the 2 jobs, the thin walls, the photograph on the shelf, she had built that. It was small, and it was insufficient in ways she didn't let herself dwell on too often, but it was hers, and it held. What she was less sure about was what she was building toward, whether she was building toward anything at all. Lily found her on a Saturday in December. Nathan had invited Clara to the estate for a late afternoon, vague about the specifics, which she was learning was a thing he did when he wanted company, but felt awkward about asking directly for it. She'd been in the library for about 20 minutes, ostensibly looking at an architectural history book that Nathan had mentioned, when the door opened 6 inches and a small face appeared at exactly the height you'd expect from a 6-year-old standing on her toes slightly. Lily Holloway had her father's dark eyes and her mother's expression, that particular quality of assessing someone without committing to a verdict. She looked at Clara with the focused attention of a person who has decided to investigate something. "You're Clara," she said. Not a question. "I am," Clara said. Lily pushed the door open fully and came into the room. She was wearing a sweater with a small embroidered fox on the chest and socks with individual toes, which Clara's brain registered and filed as an interesting detail. She walked to the armchair across from where Clara was sitting and sat in it, folding her hands in her lap with a composure that was genuinely, slightly alarming. "My father said you played Grandma Margaret's violin," Lily said. "I did." "He said you played it well." "That's kind of him." Lily tilted her head slightly. "He doesn't usually say things to be kind. He says things because they're true." Clara looked at her. "That's a sophisticated distinction." "I know what sophisticated means," Lily said, not unkindly. "My dad played me a recording of the chaconne once. He said his mother used to play it, and he wanted me to know what it sounded like." She paused. "I cried." "It'll do that." "He cried too, but he thought I wasn't watching." She said this matter-of-factly, without judgment. Then, "Do you think you'll come here a lot?" Clara considered the question seriously, because it was asked seriously. "I don't know yet." "Okay." Lily seemed to accept this. "I think my dad likes you." "I think your dad doesn't entirely know what he wants yet." Lily considered this. "That's true," she said. "He sometimes decides things before he knows why he's deciding them." A pause. "Like the violin." "Like the violin," Clara agreed. They sat together in the library for a while after that, Clara with her book and Lily with a chess problem she'd brought in her pocket, which she unfolded and studied with the intensity of someone diffusing something. It was comfortable in a way that caught Clara slightly off guard, comfortable in the specific way that being in a room with someone who doesn't need anything from you is comfortable. Lily didn't want conversation or performance or reassurance. She wanted proximity, and she wanted to work on her chess problem, and she was apparently content with those 2 things coexisting. Nathan found them like that when he came looking 20 minutes later. He stood in the doorway and looked at his daughter and Clara sitting in matching reading chairs in the afternoon light. And something moved through his expression that he didn't have time to put away before Clara noticed it. "She found me," Clara said. "She usually does," he said. Lily did not look up from her chess problem. "You were having a conversation and kept stopping in the middle of sentences," she said to her father. "It was making me tired." Nathan looked at Clara. Clara looked back at him. There was nothing particularly to say. He came into the room and sat on the arm of the sofa nearest Lily, and the three of them stayed in the library until the light went blue outside the windows and Lily fell asleep in her chair with the chess problem still in her hand, and neither Clara nor Nathan moved to disturb it, because some things are better left exactly as they are. It was in this slow, accumulating way that Clara Brooks made her way into the life of Holloway Manor. Not through the front door, not through announcement or declaration, but through Thursday mornings and library afternoons, and the particular gravitational pull of a small, serious girl with a chess problem in her pocket. And it was in this slow, accumulating way that Veronica Ashworth began to pay attention. She had been watching since the night of the birthday party. Not openly. Veronica was far too skilled at the social landscape to do anything openly that she intended to do effectively. She had watched with the patient, peripheral attention of someone cataloging a threat, assessing its dimensions, deciding on the appropriate response. She had underestimated Clara Brooks once. She did not intend to do it again. What Veronica had understood since the moment that final note dissolved into the air of the ballroom and the room came apart in its response, was that this was not a passing novelty. Nathan's interest was not the interest of a man briefly charmed and easily bored. She had watched Nathan Holloway operate socially for 2 years. She knew the face he wore when he was being polite, and the face he wore when he was actually present, and what she'd seen on his face in that ballroom had been presence. Deep, disrupted, genuine presence. That was the problem. Veronica's relationship with Nathan existed in the space between what was said and what was understood. The dinners that were not quite dates, the appearances at events that were not quite coupled, the sustained proximity that she had spent 2 years maintaining with the careful patience of someone who knows the exact shape of what she wants and is willing to invest the necessary time. She was not in love with Nathan Holloway, exactly. She was in love with what Nathan Holloway represented, the stability, the standing, the particular life that his name and his money and his manner could provide. She was 35. She was running out of patience for the slow game. And now there was a woman who had come in through the service entrance and played a dead woman's violin and made the entire room forget itself. And Nathan Holloway was having coffee with her on Thursday mornings, like a man who has discovered something he didn't know he was looking for. Veronica had drinks with 2 of her oldest friends in mid-December, a dinner at a restaurant in Midtown that was the kind of place where the tables were far apart and the prices were not listed. One of those friends, a woman named Petra, who worked in event management and moved through the city's social world like a very elegant fish in its natural water, mentioned that she'd heard Clara Brooks had actually been a prodigy once, a serious one. Juilliard, apparently, Petra said, full scholarship. There was talk of her being, exceptional, truly exceptional, and then she just vanished. What happened? Veronica asked. Petra shrugged. Some sort of family tragedy, I think. Father died. She never went back. Veronica filed this away without showing that she was filing it. She steered the conversation elsewhere and spent the rest of the dinner being charming and excellent company and drove home thinking about what you could do with information like that, how you could use it. She wasn't sure yet, but she would figure it out. She was very good at figuring things out. Meanwhile, Clara was having her own reckoning. She'd been carrying it since the night of the party, this particular awareness that something she'd buried was no longer buried. The Chaconne had cracked something open, and the weeks since hadn't closed it. She found herself noticing music again in the way she'd stopped noticing it. The specific way a string quartet coming out of someone's open window could stop her on the sidewalk. The way the piano player at the cafe near her building sometimes played in the early morning when they thought no one was listening, and she would hear it through the wall of her apartment and feel it somewhere below her ribcage like a hand pressing down. She started listening again. Real listening, not background. She'd find herself on the subway with her earbuds in and a recording of Hilary Hahn playing Brahms, and she'd close her eyes and track every decision in the performance, every choice about timing, about weight, about where the breath was. And she would feel the ghost of her own hands responding to it, her left hand sometimes moving slightly against her thigh, her bow arm feeling the phantom pull. She had not touched a violin since the party. Not because she was afraid exactly, but because she understood that if she started again, she was going to have to decide something about what that meant. She'd been putting off the deciding. It was Nathan who made her stop putting it off, though not directly and not intentionally. He called her on a Tuesday evening in late December. Unusual, because they mostly texted, had established a kind of low-pressure communication rhythm that didn't require either of them to be more available than they wanted to be. "Sorry to call," he said. "Is this a bad time?" "I'm not doing anything." She was sitting on her kitchen counter eating cereal because she'd forgotten to go to the grocery store, which she did not volunteer. "I had a conversation with Lily tonight." He sounded like a man who has had a conversation that he's still in the middle of processing. "She asked me if I was going to marry you." Clara set her bowl down. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I didn't know." A pause. She said okay, and went back to her chess problem, but she looked... He stopped. "She's been looking for something," he said, "for a long time. I can see it in her. She doesn't talk about it because she doesn't want to make me feel bad, which is very Lily. She's been protecting my feelings since she was about 4, I think, but she's been looking." Clara said nothing. "I don't want to put that on you," he said. "I want to be clear that I'm not asking you to be something for her. That's not fair to either of you." "But," Clara said, because there was clearly a but. "But I wanted you to know, because I think you should have the full picture of what you're deciding, if you're deciding anything." She sat with that for a moment. The kitchen was quiet. The radiator knocked twice. Somewhere upstairs the family was running a bath. She could hear the pipes. "Nathan," she said, "why did you really give me that violin?" He was quiet long enough that she could hear him breathing. "Because she was playing it in my memory that night," he said, "my mother. And I thought, I don't know. I thought if someone else played it the way she played it, maybe it would..." He stopped again. It sounds true," Clara said. Another silence. "Yeah," he said. It was. After they hung up, Clara sat on her kitchen counter for a while in the quiet of her apartment, with her father's photograph at the edge of her vision, and the radiator knocking, and the bath running upstairs. She thought about the practice rooms at Juilliard with their terrible fluorescent lights. She thought about the specific quality of a fully resonant violin note in an empty room, the way it seems to fill space more completely than any other sound, the way it seems to argue that even something this brief and this fragile is worth the effort of making. She thought about her father's face in that photograph, the hot dog, the squinting, the laugh. She got down from the counter and went to her bedroom closet. On the top shelf behind a box of winter sweaters and a set of sheets she'd bought optimistically and never used was a case, black, hard-sided, old, with 2 latches that had a particular resistance she remembered in her hands as soon as she touched them. She lifted it down. She sat on the edge of her bed and looked at it for a long time. Then she opened it. The violin inside was not worth a fraction of what Margaret Holloway's instrument was worth. It was a student-grade instrument she'd bought for herself at 19 with money saved from a summer waitressing job the year before her scholarship came through and she could access the school's instrument loans. It had a small repair at the seam near the upper bout, made by a luthier in the East Village who'd charged her $40 and done a fine job. The bow hair was probably dried out. The strings would need replacing. She lifted it out anyway, held it at her side, not at her shoulder, just held it. The weight of it was exactly what she remembered. Some weights are like that. They don't change, no matter how long you've been away from them. She didn't play that night. She wasn't ready for that yet. But she sat with it in her hands for a long time, until the bath upstairs stopped running and the building went quiet around her, and something that had been locked in a specific position for 11 years shifted slightly, the way ice shifts in late winter. Not gone, not warm, but less fixed than it was the moment before. The next morning, she called a music shop on West 48th and asked about strings. And in her bedroom in the estate, a 6-year-old girl with her father's dark eyes put her chess problem down, looked at the photograph of her mother on the nightstand and said, quietly, and with complete certainty, "I think something's going to be different now." She was right. She was almost always right. But what was coming was not the kind of different that any of them had planned for. The strings arrived on a Wednesday. Clara had ordered them online, dominant medium gauge, the same brand she'd used at Juilliard because some habits burrow in too deep to argue with, and they came in a small padded envelope that she left on her kitchen table for 2 days before she opened it. Not because she'd forgotten, because she was still negotiating with herself about what opening them meant. She changed the strings on a Friday evening with the television on in the background for company, her hands remembering the process with the same muscle memory that had remembered everything else. The precise angle of the peg, the specific tension to wind to before tuning, the way you stretch new strings by pulling them gently away from the fingerboard so they settle faster. She tuned it by ear, which took longer than it would have with a tuner app, but felt more honest. Then she sat on the edge of her bed with the violin in her lap and the bow in her right hand and did not play for about 4 minutes, which was its own kind of practice. When she finally brought it to her shoulder, she started with scales. Not the chaconne, not anything with weight or memory attached to it, just scales. G major, 2 octaves, slow. She played with about 60% of her normal bow pressure, carefully, the way you put weight on a leg you've injured to check if it'll hold. It held. She moved through D major, A major, the relative minors. Her intonation was slightly off in the upper positions. 11 years of disuse had cost her some of the automatic calibration, but the sound was there. The basic architecture of it was there. She played for 23 minutes and then stopped, put the violin back in its case, and sat in her kitchen and ate the rest of her cereal from that morning, which had gone soft. She felt strange in a way she couldn't quite name. Not sad, not happy. Something more like the feeling of a door that's been stuck for a long time finally moving on its hinges. A little resistant still, but moving. She texted Nathan. "Restrung my violin tonight." He replied 4 minutes later. "How did it go?" She looked at the case on her bed through the open doorway. "Like getting back on a bike that's slightly too small for you now. But okay." His response took longer this time. When it came, it was just, "I'm glad." 2 words. She read them 3 times, which she would not have admitted to anyone. The new year came in cold and without ceremony. Clara worked both jobs through the holiday week. The catering assignments dried up between Christmas and New Year's, but picked back up on the 31st, a private party in the West Village that she worked alongside 2 other servers she knew from the circuit, a man named Darnell and a woman named Grace, both of whom were doing what Clara was doing, working a job that wasn't their real life while their real life waited at some indeterminate point ahead. Darnell was finishing a nursing degree. Grace was writing a novel that she'd been writing for 4 years and that she described, with more affection than bitterness, as the world's most patient manuscript. They worked together efficiently, the way people do when they share the particular solidarity of the service industry. And at the end of the night stood outside on the sidewalk for 15 minutes in the cold while they waited for their rides home, passing a thermos of coffee that Darnell had brought. "You seem different," Grace said to Clara, studying her with the particular attention of someone whose job is observing people closely. "Different how?" "Less sealed." Grace accepted the thermos back from Darnell. "You've always had this thing where you're present, but you're also not. Like part of you is in a room with the door locked. The door seems less locked lately." Clara thought about that. "I've been playing again," she said. Grace looked at her. "Violin?" "Yeah." "That's a big deal for you." It was not a question, and Clara didn't treat it like one. "Yeah," she said. "It is." She didn't mention Nathan. She wasn't sure yet how to describe what Nathan was. Not a boyfriend, not exactly a friend, not a project or a complication, though he was something of all of those. He was a presence in her life that had arrived without her planning for it, and that she hadn't yet found the right container for. She thought about him with a frequency she found slightly inconvenient, and thought about Lily almost as often, which was its own kind of information. January moved. She played for longer periods. 20 minutes became 40, became an hour on the weekends when she had the apartment to herself. Her intonation cleaned up. The upper positions came back slowly, then faster. She started working on repertoire carefully at first, choosing pieces with less history attached to them. Telemann, Vivaldi, things she'd learned early that didn't carry the specific weight of what came later. Then, one Sunday afternoon in late January, she opened the Bach partitas and sat with the chaconne score in her lap and looked at it for a long time. She thought about the ballroom, the laughing that stopped, Nathan's face when the last note finished. She started at the beginning and played it through. It wasn't the same as the ballroom. Nothing practiced in a small apartment with a student instrument and traffic noise outside could be the same as playing in that charged, held-breath silence with 200 people and a dead woman's violin. But it was real. It was honest. And when she finished the last bar and held the final note until it disappeared, she sat in her quiet apartment and understood something she had been working toward for months without knowing it. She wanted to play again. Not in the sense of wanting to practice or wanting to maintain a skill. She wanted to perform. She wanted to stand in front of people with an instrument in her hands and offer them something true, the way she had offered it in that ballroom, and feel the room respond to it. She wanted her career back. The understanding sat in her chest like a new weight. Not heavy, not light. Significant. The kind of thing you carry differently once you've named it. She called Mrs. Vasarhelyi. The woman was 81 now and still teaching, which surprised absolutely no one who had ever met her. She lived in the same apartment on the Upper West Side she'd occupied for 40 years, and she answered the phone on the second ring with the exact same tone she'd used to answer it when Clara was 17. Brisk, unsentimental, present. "I wondered when you'd call," Mrs. Vasarhelyi said, as though it had been weeks rather than 11 years. "You wondered?" Clara said. "I heard you played Margaret Holloway's violin at a party in November." A pause. "You think things don't get around in this city?" "I had 3 calls." Clara pinched the bridge of her nose. "Who called you?" "People who were there. People who know what they're hearing when they hear it." The old woman's voice was matter-of-fact, not warm exactly. She had never done warm exactly, but something underneath it that served the same function. "I also heard it was a somewhat dramatic occasion." "That's one word for it." "Come on Tuesday," Mrs. Vasarhelyi said. "Bring the Bartók concerto. We'll see what 11 years has done to you." She went on Tuesday. What 11 years had done to her was complicated and took about 2 hours to assess, and Mrs. Vasarhelyi assessed it with the efficient, unsentimental thoroughness of a surgeon, making notes in the margin of Clara's score in her small, cramped handwriting. The technique was there, she said. The musical intelligence was intact. The intonation needed work in specific positions. She circled 3 measures in the second movement, and the bow arm had developed a slight tension in the shoulder that would need addressing before she could play at full volume over extended periods without fatigue. "But the voice is still yours," Mrs. Vasarhelyi said, which from her was approximately equivalent to anyone else falling to their knees in praise. "That's the thing I wasn't sure about. Technique you can rebuild. Voice you either have or you've lost." She handed the score back. "You have it." Clara walked home from the Upper West Side instead of taking the subway. It was 40 blocks, and it was cold, and she needed the space to think. She walked down Broadway with her hands in her coat pockets and her violin case on her back, and thought about what it meant to be 30 years old and starting over. Not from zero. She understood that. She wasn't starting from zero, but she was starting from somewhere far behind where she'd been at 21, and the distance between those 2 points was real, and not nothing. She thought about her father. He'd worked 2 jobs his entire adult life, a day shift at a printing company, evenings managing inventory at a hardware store 2 blocks from their apartment. He'd never complained about it. He'd also never stopped going to her performances, even when she was young, and the performances were school recitals in overheated gymnasiums with folding chairs and terrible acoustics. He'd sat in those folding chairs in his good shirt and watched her play with the same expression every time, the squinting, the small private smile. And once, when she was 14 and had messed up a shift in the 3rd movement of a Brahms sonata and been devastated about it for 3 days afterward, he had said, "Clara, you made a mistake. You didn't stop." Those are 2 different things. She'd been thinking about that sentence for 16 years. She didn't stop. She was going to stop stopping. It was into this particular season of Clara's life. The practices at the apartment, the Tuesday lessons, the slow, deliberate process of rebuilding something she'd abandoned, that the Holloway situation deepened. She was spending more time at the estate, not living there, not employed there anymore. She'd left the catering work in January, the schedule having become incompatible with the lesson commitments, but present there in a way that had developed its own logic. Thursday mornings were still coffee, usually at Denny's Corner, sometimes at the estate kitchen if Nathan had morning meetings and couldn't get away. The library afternoons continued. Lily had started something she called lessons, which were not technically lessons because Clara wasn't qualified to teach, and they both understood this, but which involved Lily sitting next to Clara on the piano bench in the music room while Clara showed her basic music theory and let her pluck the violin strings and explained what she was hearing. Lily was, predictably, preternaturally good at music theory. She had the same relationship to it that she had to chess, pattern recognition as a natural language. She understood intervals by feel within 2 sessions. She asked questions that Clara had to think about before answering, which was the best kind of question. "Why does a minor chord sound sad?" Lily asked one afternoon in February, 3 days before her 7th birthday. "It doesn't always," Clara said. "It depends on context. But there's a theory that minor intervals, the specific distances between the notes, mimic certain sounds that occur naturally when things are in distress. Animals, humans. So our brains have an association." Lily considered this. "So the music is sad because something in us remembers something sad." "Roughly, yes. But then why does sad music sometimes feel good to listen to?" Clara looked at her, 6 years old, 7 in 3 days. "That," she said, "is one of the best questions anyone has ever asked me." Lily looked satisfied. "I'll think about it," she said, and turned back to the keyboard. Nathan watched these sessions sometimes from the doorway, not interrupting. Clara would notice him there and not say anything, and he wouldn't announce himself, and Lily usually knew he was there and also didn't say anything. And it became one of the small rituals of those months. Nathan standing in the doorway of the music room with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up after a day of work, watching his daughter learn to listen. It was in February that things began to shift in ways that none of them were watching for. Veronica Ashworth had been patient for a long time. She had watched and cataloged and waited with the specific patience of a person who has decided on an outcome and is waiting for the right instrument. She found it in the form of a woman named Sandra Chen, a former personal assistant who had left Holloway Enterprises 8 months ago under circumstances that were, depending on who you asked, either a straightforward resignation or something that had been encouraged. Sandra had a grievance. Veronica had the social connections and the money to make that grievance useful. She met Sandra for lunch at a quiet restaurant in Murray Hill, the kind of place with banquette seating and low lighting that made it easy to have a private conversation in public. Sandra was 38, precise, and arrived with the careful energy of someone who has rehearsed what they're going to say and is waiting for the right moment to say it. "I'm not doing anything illegal," Sandra said, before Veronica had offered her anything. "I'm not asking you to," Veronica said, which was true in the narrow technical sense she intended. "I'm just interested in helping Nathan and the people around him make informed decisions." Sandra looked at her carefully. "What does that mean?" "It means," Veronica said, picking up her wine glass, "that sometimes people need a little help seeing what's right in front of them, and sometimes helping them see clearly is a service, not a harm." What Veronica did not want to do was take something that belonged to Clara Brooks. She was not, in her own self-assessment, a thief. What she wanted was something more elegant than theft. She wanted to create a situation in which Clara's presence in Nathan's life became untenable, in which Nathan's own sense of responsibility and reputation did the work for her. She wanted to engineer a choice between trust and doubt, and she wanted doubt to win. The opportunity arrived in the form of Margaret Holloway's necklace. It was a piece that few people knew about, a diamond and sapphire pendant on a platinum chain, old European cut stones made in Paris in 1962 and given to Margaret Holloway by her mother on the occasion of her engagement. It lived in a jewelry case in what had been the main bedroom before Nathan converted it to a study, in a small drawer that was never locked because the estate's security was pervasive enough that internal locking felt redundant. Clara had seen it once, by accident, when Nathan had opened the wrong drawer looking for a document. "That was my grandmother's," Nathan had said, closing the drawer quickly. Then, after a beat, "My mother never wore it. She said it was too valuable. She was afraid of losing it." Clara had registered it then and filed it away with the other details she was accumulating about this family. The specific topography of their grief and their history, and the things they couldn't quite look at directly. The necklace disappeared on a Thursday in late February. Clara had been at the estate that afternoon, a library visit that had extended into dinner, which happened sometimes now, organically, without planning, because Lily asked and Nathan didn't argue. She'd left around 9, taken the subway home, done her practice, gone to sleep. She hadn't been in the study. She hadn't been near the study. These facts were clear to her and clear to Nathan, or should have been. Nathan called her on Friday morning, and she knew immediately from the quality of his voice that something was wrong. Not wrong in the way of bad news delivered directly. Wrong in the way of something uncertain being handled badly. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Okay. Were you in the study at any point last night?" She was standing at her kitchen counter with her coffee. The question landed somewhere odd. "No," she said. "I was in the library and the kitchen and the music room. I didn't go upstairs." A silence that was a half-second too long. "Okay." "Nathan." Her voice was careful. "What happened?" "My grandmother's necklace is missing." He said it quickly, like he was pulling off something that needed to be fast. "It was in the study drawer. It's not there now." She put her mug down. "When did you last see it?" "Tuesday. I was looking for something and I opened that drawer by mistake, the same way you did that time." Another pause. "There have only been a few people in that part of the house this week." She understood then what was happening, and the understanding arrived not with shock but with a particular cold clarity. The kind that comes when you see something you didn't want to see, but some part of you recognized before your conscious mind caught up. "Are you asking if I took it?" she said. "I'm not. No. I'm trying to understand what—" "Nathan, are you asking if I took it?" The silence this time was longer. "One of the housekeeping staff mentioned they'd seen you near the hallway outside the study," he said. His voice was careful in a way that she recognized as the voice of a man trying to be fair and not quite managing it. "I'm not accusing you. I just need to understand." "I was not in the study," Clara said. "I was not near the study. I have no idea where your grandmother's necklace is." "Clara, do you believe me?" Another silence. This one felt like it had weight. She closed her eyes for 1 second. She thought about her father. "You made a mistake. You didn't stop." "Those are two different things." She thought about Mrs. Vasarhei telling her the voice was still there. She thought about Lily asking why sad music felt good to listen to, and the way the child had said, "I'll think about it," with the serene confidence of someone who never stopped thinking about anything. She thought about the violin in her apartment case, restrung and slightly out of tune in the upper positions, and hers, undeniably hers, and she thought about the year she'd spent folding herself smaller and smaller until she took up almost no space at all. "Do you believe me?" she said again. Nathan said, "I have to protect my family, Clara," which was not an answer, which was, in its way, worse than a direct no. She kept her voice level. It cost her. "I understand." "I'm not saying, but—" "Nathan, I understand." She picked up her coffee mug and then set it down again because her hands were not quite steady and she did not want to drop it. "I think you should look carefully at everyone who had access to that room this week. I think you should look at the security footage. And I think that until you've done that and you know what happened, you shouldn't say anything to me that you can't take back." He was quiet for a moment. "That's fair," he said. "You're right." "I know I'm right." She stopped, steadied. "I'm going to go practice now." She hung up and stood in her kitchen for 3 minutes, not moving. Then she got her violin out, sat on the edge of her bed, and played. Not the chaconne, not the Bartók. She played the Adagio from Bach's Sonata number, one in G minor, which was the piece she'd learned at 14 when she was going through a period of finding everything difficult. And her father had sat on her bed and listened to her practice it for 3 consecutive evenings, not saying anything, just being there. She played it slowly. She played every note with full weight. She played it like it had something to say, and she intended to let it say it. She was halfway through when her phone buzzed. She stopped, checked it. It was a text from a number she didn't recognize. "I know you didn't take it. I also know who did, but nobody's going to believe either of us. Be careful." She stared at the text for a long time. She tried calling the number back. It rang 4 times and went to a generic voicemail. She texted, "Who is this?" No reply came. She put the phone down and finished the adagio. What happened in the next 48 hours happened in the particular way that bad things happen when they've been carefully arranged by someone patient enough to arrange them. Nathan asked his head of household security, a calm, methodical man named Robert Yates, who had been with the family for 12 years, to conduct a discreet inventory of who had been in which part of the estate over the previous week. Yates began systematically. He would have found the answer eventually. He was thorough. He was good at his job. But on Saturday morning, before Yates had completed his review, something was found. One of the upstairs housekeeping staff, a woman named Pearl, who was 63 and had been with the estate for 9 years, and who Clara had always found kind, had always liked, was changing the linens in the small room at the back of the 3rd floor that Clara used when she stayed late and the trains were running slow. Pearl was not looking for anything. She was doing her job. She stripped the bed, checked the dresser for forgotten items per protocol, and opened the small drawer in the nightstand. The necklace was there. Pearl stood for a long moment looking at it. Then she went and found Robert Yates. Yates called Nathan. Clara was at her apartment when Nathan called. She was in the middle of her morning practice, a scale run she'd been working on to clean up the 3rd position, and she almost didn't answer. Then she saw his name and set the bow down. Pearl found the necklace, Nathan said. Something in his voice told her everything before he said the rest of it. Where? She said. Not a question. In the nightstand drawer, in the room you use. She sat very still. The apartment was quiet around her. The traffic outside, the radiator, the specific silence of a Friday morning in a building where most people had already left for work. She thought about the anonymous text. I know you didn't take it. I also know who did. Someone had known this was coming. Someone had warned her, and she hadn't known what to do with the warning. Nathan, she said carefully, someone put it there. Clara, someone put it there. I have not been in that room since January. You can check that. I know. But his voice had that quality again. The careful, fractured quality of a man trying to hold 2 contradictory things at once and finding that the holding was costing him. Robert is reviewing everything. I haven't concluded anything. But, she said, he didn't say anything. There were people at that party, she said. There were people at your birthday party who would not like what's been happening between us. You know that. You have to know that. I know that people have opinions, he said. I also know that I have a responsibility to this house and to my daughter. And right now I have a necklace that belonged to my grandmother found in a room that you use, and I don't... He stopped. I don't know what to do with that. You do the same thing I told you to do on Friday, Clara said. You look at the footage. You look at who had access. You think about who benefits from this. She stopped herself, breathed. And you decide whether you trust me or you don't. Because those are the only options available to you right now, Nathan. There's no middle ground where you sort of trust me and sort of don't. That's not trust. The silence stretched. I have to think, he said finally. I know, she said. Think as long as you need to. She paused. There was something else she'd been going to say, something about the text message, about the unknown number, about the warning she'd received before she'd had any idea there was something to be warned about. She should tell him. She knew she should tell him. But there was something in his voice, that fracture, that careful management of doubt, that made her understand with a cold and specific clarity that she had reached the limit of what she could ask him to hold. She could tell him about the text and watch him try to process one more piece of information on top of everything else, watch him struggle to incorporate it, and it still might not be enough to tip the balance. Or she could say nothing and give him the space to reach his own conclusions. She said nothing. I'll call you, he said. She didn't wait for the call. She packed a small bag, 3 days of clothing, her practice materials, her father's photograph, her violin, and called a friend from the catering circuit who had a couch in Boston that she'd offered twice in the last 2 years. She texted the friend. The friend said yes immediately, the way real friends do. She looked around her apartment, the cereal bowl on the counter, the bookshelf with the broken spine paperbacks, the window with the view of the wet street. She'd built this. It was small, and it was insufficient, and it was hers. She picked up her violin case. She put her father's photograph in her bag, tucking it between two shirts so it wouldn't shift. Then she opened the door and walked down the 4 flights to the street. The city was gray outside, February gray, with the particular flat cold of a morning that has decided not to commit to anything dramatic. She walked to the subway entrance and stood at the top of the stairs for a moment, the wind off the street moving through her hair, the city noise rising around her. She thought about what her father had said. "You made a mistake. You didn't stop." She hadn't made a mistake. Someone else had made one on her behalf, and Nathan Holloway had let doubt do what doubt does best, fill the space where trust was supposed to be. But she was not going to stop. She went down the stairs. She took the train to Penn Station. She bought a ticket to Boston. She sat in the window seat with her violin case across her knees and her bag at her feet, and as the train moved out of the tunnel and into the pale February light, she did not look back at the city receding behind her. She opened her score, the Bartók Concerto, second movement, and began to study. Behind her, in a room on the 3rd floor of an estate in Westchester, a 6-year-old girl with dark eyes stood at the window of the library and watched the driveway where Clara's car should have been and was not, and felt something settle in her chest with the specific weight of something she had been half expecting and had hoped very much would not happen. She went back to her chess problem, but she didn't see the board for a long time. Robert Yates was not a man who rushed. It was the quality that had made him good at his job for 22 years, not in the Holloway estate specifically, but in the broader work of keeping complicated households running without visible seams. He was 60, methodical, and he had a particular professional philosophy that he had never articulated out loud because he didn't see the need to articulate things that were simply true, that the first explanation for anything was almost never the correct one, and that patience, applied consistently, would eventually locate the truth in any situation. He had not said this to Nathan on Saturday morning when he called about the necklace. He had said, "I'll finish the review, Mr. Holloway," and then he had gone back to finishing the review. He found the first anomaly on Sunday. The estate's camera system covered the main hallways, the entry points, the exterior perimeter, and 3 interior common areas. It did not cover private rooms. Nathan had been firm about that when the system was installed, a privacy boundary he maintained even with his own security infrastructure. But it covered the hallway outside the room Clara used, and it covered the stairwell that was the only practical access point to that wing of the 3rd floor. Yates had been reviewing footage methodically, working backward from Saturday morning when Pearl found the necklace. He went back through Friday, through Thursday. The camera in the 3rd floor hallway showed normal traffic. Pearl on her regular rounds, one of the other housekeeping staff replacing towels on Wednesday afternoon, Nathan walking through on Tuesday evening. Clara appeared in the footage exactly twice, arriving on Thursday afternoon, visible at the far end of the hall, moving toward the library in the opposite wing, and leaving at 9:17 on Thursday evening. She did not go near the room. She did not go near that wing of the 3rd floor at all. He kept going back. Wednesday, Tuesday. On Tuesday evening at 11:43, after Nathan had gone to bed and the house was quiet, the stairwell camera caught someone on the 3rd floor landing. The figure was wearing dark clothing and moving with the specific, careful quality of someone who knew where the cameras were positioned, staying close to the wall at the edge of the frame, keeping their head angled down. It wasn't enough to completely avoid capture, but it was enough to make identification difficult. Yates slowed the footage, paused it, studied the frame for a long time. Then he pulled up the exterior camera footage for Tuesday evening. The estate had 2 cameras covering the service entrance at the rear of the property. One mounted above the door, one angled across the service driveway. At 11:21 on Tuesday evening, a car entered through the service gate using a code. Yates checked the code log. The code was a guest access code, a 6-digit sequence that Nathan issued periodically for vendors and approved visitors. He checked when that specific code had last been issued. The record showed it had been given to a florist delivery service 8 months ago and not revoked. Standard administrative oversight. It happened. He ran the car's license plate through the system they used for estate visitor management. The plate came back registered to a car rental company. He called the company, identified himself with the estate's legal account number, and asked for the renter's information on that date. They gave it to him. He sat looking at the name for a moment. Then he called Nathan. It was Sunday evening. Nathan had spent the weekend in a state that he would not have described to anyone because he didn't have adequate language for it. He had spent Saturday and most of Sunday doing the thing he was worst at, which was waiting for Yates, waiting for clarity, waiting for the specific exoneration that he already understood, somewhere below the defensible surface of his doubt, that Clara deserved. He had not called her. He had picked up his phone 6 times to call her and put it down 6 times because he didn't know what to say that wasn't inadequate. He'd said, "I have to protect my family," and she'd said, "I know," in a voice that meant something considerably more than "I know." And he'd sat with the echo of that conversation for 48 hours and felt it get worse with repetition. Lily had not spoken to him about Clara since Friday. This was unusual. Lily spoke about everything, processed everything aloud with the thoroughness of a small scientist collecting data. Her silence on the subject of Clara was pointed in a way that only a 7-year-old could make pointed. Completely without performance, completely without manipulation, just an absence where the conversation would have been, which was its own kind of verdict. On Sunday evening, he was in the study when Yates called. "I need to show you something," Yates said. "Can you come to the security office?" He went. Yates had the footage pulled up on 2 monitors when Nathan arrived, the 3rd-floor stairwell and the service entrance exterior. He walked Nathan through it methodically, without commentary, the way he always presented findings. Here's what the footage shows. Here's what the records show. Here is where the threads connect. Nathan watched the figure in dark clothing on the 3rd-floor landing. He watched the car enter through the service gate. He watched Yates pull up the rental record. The name on the screen was Sandra Chen. He knew the name. He knew the circumstances under which Sandra Chen had left his company 8 months ago, a situation that had been handled quietly, an HR matter involving conduct that had been documented and addressed, and that Sandra had contested with the specific bitterness of someone who believed they'd been treated unfairly, regardless of the documentation. "She didn't act alone," Nathan said. He was looking at the screen, but he wasn't really seeing it anymore. He was thinking. "The access code was old," Yates said, "but someone would have needed to know it was still active. Someone with familiarity with the estate's visitor management system, or someone who had it from before." He paused. Sandra Chen's last day of access to any Holloway system was 8 months ago. The code predates her departure. She would have needed to retain it or acquire it from someone who had it more recently. Nathan leaned forward. Who else had that code? Yates pulled up another window, the log of guest access codes issued over the past year. He scrolled to the relevant date. The code had been issued twice, to the florist service and 3 weeks before that, to a personal guest of Nathan's. Issued at Nathan's own verbal request, which Yates had processed and documented. The guest's name was Veronica Ashworth. Nathan did not move for a long time. He was not a man who made mistakes lightly. He was not a man who, generally speaking, missed things. Part of what had built his career was the capacity to look at a situation without the distortion of what he wanted to be true, to see the thing as it was, rather than as it was most convenient for it to be. He had applied this capacity to real estate deals and contract negotiations and personnel decisions for 8 years, and it had served him consistently. He had not applied it to this. He had stood in a position where doubt was the easier option, and he had chosen it, and a woman who had done nothing wrong had left on a train with her father's photograph in her bag and her violin on her back, and the fact that he had not called her in 48 hours was suddenly the clearest evidence of his own failure that he had encountered in recent memory. "Get me everything," he said to Yates. "Every piece of footage, the rental record, the code log, the access timestamps, all of it." "Already compiled," Yates said, and handed him a folder. He stood in the security office for another moment. "Thank you, Robert." "Of course, Mr. Holloway." He went upstairs. He sat in the library, the same room where Clara had been sitting the first afternoon Lily found her, in the same chair. And he made 3 calls. The first was to his attorney, a calm, precise woman named Harriet Bloom, who he'd worked with for 6 years and who received the information he gave her with the same manner she received everything, without surprise, without judgment, moving immediately to what needed to be done. The second call was to the company that managed the estate's security contracts, authorizing Yates to share the compiled footage with Harriet's office. The third call was longer and less comfortable, and was to a contact he had in the city's social infrastructure. Someone who moved in the same circles as Veronica Ashworth, and who was, when Nathan explained what he had found, neither surprised nor reluctant to confirm certain things that he had suspected but not yet verified. He hung up from the third call and sat in the library with the folder on his knee and the room dark around him. He hadn't turned the lights on when he came in and hadn't noticed. The windows showed the night outside, the garden, the distant lights of the driveway, the dark outline of the tree line. He thought about the night of his birthday party, the moment he'd unlocked the cabinet and taken out his mother's violin and crossed the room and held it out to a woman he'd known for approximately 12 seconds. He told Clara he didn't entirely know what that impulse had been. He'd been honest about that, or as honest as he knew how to be. But sitting in the dark in the library now, he thought he understood it more clearly than he had before. He'd been holding that cabinet closed for 2.5 years. He'd been holding a lot of things closed for a lot longer than that. And something about Clara Brooks standing there in her slightly too small shoes, with her empty tray and her complete refusal to be embarrassed, had made him feel, for a moment that bypassed all his careful management, like something could be opened without breaking. He had then proceeded to let doubt close it again. And she had walked away with her violin and her father's photograph and her perfectly level voice, and he had sat with the wreckage of his own failure to be the thing he'd been trying, for 8 years and for one specific night, to be. He picked up his phone. He stared at her name in his contacts. He put the phone back down. He was not going to do this by phone. He understood that clearly. Whatever he said to Clara Brooks needed to be said in person, with no buffer, no distance, no ability to hang up if it became difficult. She deserved that, and he owed it to himself to not take the easier option again. But first there was something that needed to happen before that conversation. Harriet Bloom was efficient. It was the thing Nathan valued most about working with her. She moved without friction when there was something to move on, and she had over 6 years developed an instinct for which situations required speed and which required patience. This one, she understood immediately, required both: speed in the assembly of evidence, patience in the deployment of it. She spent Monday verifying the documentation Yates had compiled, cross-referencing the rental record, having the code log authenticated, obtaining a second copy of the exterior footage through the estate's security company's independent servers so there could be no question of tampering. She also, through channels she had spent years developing, obtained certain financial records that she was not technically authorized to request, but that were offered voluntarily by someone who owed her a professional favor, and who was, it emerged, not entirely surprised by what the records showed. The records showed 2 transfers from Veronica Ashworth's personal account to Sandra Chen's in the weeks preceding the birthday party. One in early November, one the week after. The amounts were not enormous, but they were specific in a way that suggested purpose rather than generosity. Harriet called Nathan on Monday evening. "We have enough," she said. "For what?" "For whatever you want to do with it." She paused. "What do you want to do with it, Nathan?" He had been thinking about this. "I want her to know that I know," he said. "Privately, first, and then not privately." Harriet was quiet for a moment. "The not privately part. Do you understand what that does to your social relationships in this city?" "I understand what happens to my social relationships if I don't," he said. "There's a woman in Boston who left this house because I chose doubt over trust. I'm not especially concerned about the social relationships." Another pause. "All right," Harriet said. "I'll set up the meeting." The meeting with Veronica happened on Tuesday afternoon in Harriet's office on Park Avenue, a room that was designed, not accidentally, to remove any advantage that came from familiar territory. Veronica arrived in a camel coat with a lawyer of her own, a man named Pierce, who sat beside her with the particular stillness of someone preparing to dispute everything, and dispute it loudly. She looked at Nathan across the table with an expression that was managing itself carefully. Not quite casual, not quite nervous, maintaining the performance of someone who has nothing to explain. Harriet laid the documentation on the table without preamble. The rental record, the code log, the exterior footage stills time-stamped, the financial transfers. Veronica looked at the items as they were placed in front of her. Pierce leaned forward, reviewed them, and leaned back. Something in his posture changed subtly in the way of a man recalibrating. This is circumstantial, Pierce said. The transfers aren't, Harriet said. And Sandra Chen has already been contacted by my office. This was a slight embellishment. Harriet had sent a letter to Sandra's last known address that morning, advising her that certain documentation was being reviewed in connection with an incident at the Holloway estate and that her cooperation would be noted. It was careful language. It was enough. Veronica's composure fractured briefly. It was a small thing, a tightening around the eyes, a microsecond where the management slipped. But Nathan saw it. He'd spent 8 years reading people across tables. He saw it clearly. "Veronica," he said. He kept his voice level. Not angry, not cold, just direct, the way he should have been direct about a number of things, considerably earlier. "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Not because the answer changes what I know, but because the answer changes what happens next." She looked at him. "Did you arrange for that necklace to be placed in Clara's room?" Pierce put a hand on Veronica's arm. She shook it off. She looked at Nathan with an expression that had stopped performing anything, an expression that was simply what it was. A person caught in the specific exposure of having been seen clearly. "You were making a mistake," she said. Her voice was quiet and controlled and completely without apology. She is not someone who belongs in your life. In Lily's life. She's a catering worker who got lucky at a party. And you were—" She stopped. "You were not thinking clearly." "I was thinking clearly for the first time in years," Nathan said. "The silence in the room was the kind that has decisions in it." "Here is what's going to happen," Harriet said, taking the papers back from the center of the table with the calm efficiency of someone closing a chapter. "You are going to make a full statement, you and Sandra Chen separately, with independent representation if you prefer. The statement will be provided to Nathan's attorney's office and filed appropriately. In return, Nathan is not pursuing criminal charges at this time." She looked at Pierce. "That can change. I want that understood." Pierce looked at Veronica. Veronica looked at the table. "Fine," she said. One word, flat and final, like a door closing. Nathan stood. He didn't say anything else to Veronica. There was nothing that needed saying. The documentation had said it, and he was no longer interested in the conversation that would come after the documentation. He was interested in Boston. He was in his car and heading back to Westchester before 3 o'clock. He had not told Lily what was happening, not in detail. But Lily had watched him with those dark, assessing eyes all weekend, tracking the specific changes in his posture and his face that she had become expert at reading over 7 years. And on Monday morning she had said, over breakfast, without looking up from her chess problem, "You're going to fix it, right?" He had said, "I'm trying to." She had nodded once. "Okay," she said, and had gone back to the chess problem. He told her that evening, Tuesday, after the meeting, that he was going to Boston. She put the chess problem down, which was how he knew she'd been waiting for this. "Can I come?" she asked. "Not this time." She studied him. "Are you going to say sorry?" "Yes." "Good." She picked the chess problem back up. Then, after a moment, "Tell her I said hi." He found Clara's Boston address through a mutual contact from the catering world, Darnell, who had Clara's friend's number from a shared shift 2 years ago, and who gave it to Nathan with the energy of someone who had been briefed on the situation and had opinions about it. Nathan called the friend, a woman named Josephine, who had opinions that were considerably less restrained than Darnell's, but who eventually gave him the address after he had answered what felt like a preliminary interview conducted in the tone of someone deciding whether he deserved the information. He drove to Boston on Wednesday morning. He had not been to Boston in 2 years, a development deal that had come and gone without resolution. He drove up the I-95 corridor with the heat running and a coffee in the cup holder and the radio off because he didn't want noise. He wanted to think. He thought about what he was going to say, rehearsed it, abandoned it, tried different versions, abandoned those too. He was not, at the core of it, a man who was good at apology. Not because he was too proud. He had a reasonably clear understanding of his own limitations. But because he tended to lead with explanation when he should lead with acknowledgement, a habit he'd been working on with imperfect results. He arrived in Boston mid-morning. Josephine's apartment was in a neighborhood in Somerville, a street of triple-deckers with front porches and the particular look of a neighborhood that had been affordable 15 years ago and was now in transition. He parked half a block down because the space directly in front was taken and walked to the building with his hands in his jacket pockets and his breath visible in the February cold. He rang the bell and waited. Josephine answered. She was 40-something, natural hair, the expression of someone who had specifically not decided to be charmed yet. "She's not here," Josephine said. "Do you know where she is?" Josephine looked at him for a long moment. "She's been playing," she said, "since she got here. There's a practice room at the community music school 2 blocks over. She goes in the morning and sometimes again in the afternoon." She paused, making a final assessment. "It's on Elm, brown building, green door." "Thank you," Nathan said. "Don't make her regret going back," Josephine said. It was not phrased as a threat exactly. It was phrased as information, the way someone tells you the weather because they think you should know it. He found the music school. It was a narrow building between a laundromat and a Vietnamese restaurant, with a buzzer panel and a handwritten sign about practice room booking. The front door was unlocked. He went in. The hallway was dim, with that particular institutional smell of old carpet and instrument cases and decades of accumulated sound. Doors off both sides, most of them closed, most of them producing muffled evidence of someone working. A piano scale, a trumpet figure being repeated with patient persistence, the low register of a cello going over the same 2 bars. Nathan stood in the hallway and listened and found what he was looking for at the end of the corridor on the left. A door that was slightly ajar, through which came a sound he recognized. She was playing the Bartók. He stood in the hallway and listened. He did not open the door. He knew enough about practice to understand that opening a door in the middle of a serious session was a particular kind of interruption that changed things, and he wasn't ready to change things yet. He wanted to hear her first. The Bartók Violin Concerto. Number 2 was not music he knew well. He'd looked it up after she'd mentioned working on it. Read the Wikipedia entry, listened to a recording on his phone in the car one Thursday morning, tried to understand it with the limited architecture of someone who loved music but didn't have the technical language for it. What he'd understood was that it was difficult, and that it was enormous in the way that certain things are enormous, not in scale but in what they contain. Listening to Clara play it in a narrow practice room in Somerville was different from the recording. The recording was polished, curved, completed. This was rough in places, stopping and restarting, going back over passages with the focused repetition of someone solving a problem. But underneath the roughness was something that the recording couldn't contain in the same way. The thing he'd heard in his mother's ballroom and hadn't had language for until Lily, at age 6, had articulated it better than he could. She plays it like she's having an argument with it. She was arguing with Bartók. She was holding her own. He waited until she stopped. A natural pause, a longer break, the sound of a page turning, before he knocked on the doorframe. Silence. Then, "Joe, I said I'd be back by—" She stopped. He heard movement. The door opened fully. She looked at him. She was in a gray sweatshirt and jeans, her hair pulled back unevenly, rosin dust on the sweatshirt from where the bow had scattered it. She was holding the violin at her side by the neck, bow in the other hand. She looked tired in the way that people look tired when they've been working at something real, not exhausted, but spent in a specific, purposeful way. She did not look happy to see him. She did not look unhappy either. She looked like someone who is reserving judgment, which he understood he had earned. "How did you find me?" she said. "Josephine." "She gave you the address?" Something flickered in her expression. "She likes approximately 6 people." "I got the impression she was on the fence about me." He paused. "Can I come in?" She stepped back and let him through, which he counted as something. The practice room was small, barely enough for the upright piano against the wall, 2 chairs, and enough space to bow without hitting anything. A music stand with the Bartók score on it, a case open on one of the chairs, a paper coffee cup on the piano, half full. He didn't sit. He wasn't sure he'd earned sitting yet. Robert finished the security review, he said. I know what you found. Her voice was even. You wouldn't be here if you hadn't found it. You're right. He didn't argue with that because she was right. The exterior footage shows someone entering through the service gate on Tuesday night using a guest access code, a rental car. The rental record puts the car with Sandra Chen, a former employee who left under. I know who Sandra Chen is, Clara said. Pearl mentioned her once. Something about a situation that was handled. He nodded. Sandra didn't act alone. The access code had been given to Veronica. Something shifted in Clara's face. Not surprise, he noticed. Recognition. She had already put most of this together, he suspected. She had always been several steps ahead of where she led on. I met with Veronica yesterday, he said, with our attorneys. She's giving a full statement. He paused. She's done. Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she turned and set her violin carefully in its case, setting the bow alongside it with the same attention she always gave the instrument before she turned back. I want to say something, she said, and I want you to let me finish before you say anything. All right. What hurt? She said, and her voice was steady, but it cost her something. He could see it costing her. Was not the accusation. I understood where that came from. Evidence was placed. You saw it. You didn't have the full picture. That's explainable. She paused. What hurt was the silence. The 48 hours of silence when you already knew that I'd told you I didn't do it and you let the silence happen anyway. That's not about the necklace, Nathan. That's about whether you were willing to stand behind me when it was difficult, and you weren't. She looked at him directly. I need you to understand that that's what I'm sitting with, not the rest of it, that part. He stood in the practice room and let that land where it needed to land. I know, he said. You're right. I chose the easier thing and called it protecting my family, and it wasn't. It was cowardice. He paused. I've been trying to figure out how to say that in a way that doesn't sound like I'm making it about myself, and I can't find a way that doesn't, so I'm just going to say it plainly. I was wrong. I should have believed you, not because the evidence eventually backed you up. Before it did. I should have believed you because I know you, and what I know of you and what you were being accused of don't go together. She was quiet. I'm not asking you to come back, he said. I'm not asking you for anything. I came because I needed to say that to your face. He reached into his jacket. He'd been carrying it since Monday, since the moment he'd taken it from the study, and held it in his hands and made a decision. He set it on top of the piano. It was her father's violin, not the student instrument she'd brought to Boston. That one was in the case beside her. This was different. He'd had it authenticated by a luthier in the city, the same man who'd worked on his mother's instrument over the years. The man had confirmed it, a fine, mid-tier workshop instrument, Italian-style construction, worth considerably more than it appeared to be. Nathan had also confirmed something else. He'd found the maker's label inside and traced the provenance, found the record of the sale, found that it had been sold in a lot with 3 other instruments at an auction 14 years ago when a music school in Queens had closed. Clara's father had bought it the same year. It had been in a repair shop in the East Village for years. The same shop, the same luthier, who had kept it when the work went unpaid after the owner died, and who had almost sold it twice but hadn't, for reasons he described as intuition. Nathan had bought it. He set it on the piano. Clara looked at the case. She didn't move. That's... She stopped. He watched her face do something complicated. How did you... It took some finding, he said. I should have started looking a long time ago. She crossed the room in 2 steps and opened the case and stood looking at the instrument inside. He watched her hand move toward it and stopped just before touching it, the way you don't touch things you're not sure are real yet. This is my father's violin, she said. Her voice was different, stripped of the careful control. Just the fact of it, plain. Yes. She touched it then. Just a fingertip along the grain, the way you'd touch something that had been somewhere far away and come back. Her jaw was tight. She was holding something together that was working hard against being held. He didn't say anything. This wasn't the moment for anything. She stood with her hand on the instrument for a long time. Then she closed the case carefully and turned around. Her eyes were not dry, but she was not crying either. The specific state of someone standing precisely on the line between those two things through pure determination. Lily says, "Hi," he said. Something broke loose in her face at that. A small collapse. A surrendering of something she'd been bracing. She looked at him, and for a moment she looked like exactly who she was. A 30-year-old woman in a borrowed sweatshirt in a practice room in Somerville, trying to figure out if what she was being offered was real enough to trust. "How is she?" Clara asked. "She finished the chess book," he said. "She's already found 3 mistakes in it." He paused. "She hasn't talked about you since Friday, which for Lily means she's been thinking about you constantly." Clara made a sound that was almost a laugh. "She also," he said, "asked me this morning if I was going to be an idiot about it or fix it." "What did you say?" "I said I was going to try to fix it." He looked at her. "I'd like to try to fix it, Clara." She looked at him for a long time. The practice room was quiet around them. The muffled sounds of the building, the trumpet down the hall still working on its figure, the cello 2 bars repeated one more time. "I'm not coming back to be someone's staff," she said. "I'm not coming back to something undefined. If there's a reason to come back, it needs to be a real reason. A clear one." "I know. And I have things I'm doing here. Mrs. Wasserhey is talking to someone at the New England Conservatory. There might be a residency. There might be—" She stopped. "My career is starting again. I'm not stopping it for anything." "I'm not asking you to stop anything," he said. And then, "I have been trying, for the better part of 6 months, to think of the right container for what this is between us. And I keep coming back to the same answer, which is that the right container is whatever you need it to be. I'm not built for making grand declarations." He paused. "I think you know that by now." "You proposed marriage to a stranger at your own birthday party," she said. "That was apparently an exception." She looked at him for one more long moment. Then she picked up her bow, turned to the music stand, and looked at the Bartók score. "I need to finish the second movement before 12, she said. Josephine made lunch. He stood in the practice room, not entirely sure what had just happened. Am I staying?" She glanced back at him over her shoulder. "There's a chair." He sat in the chair. He folded his jacket over his knee. He watched her bring the violin to her shoulder and find her place in the score. And he sat in the small practice room with the rosin dust and the upright piano and the half-full paper coffee cup and listened to her argue with Bartók. She was still winning. Outside, February was doing what February does, cold and gray and indeterminate, not yet winter, not yet anything else. The kind of month that doesn't commit to what it's becoming. Nathan Holloway sat in a folding chair in a practice room in Somerville and understood, with the specific clarity of a man who has been wrong about something important and knows it, that this was not the end of anything. It was, for the first time in a long time, the beginning of something real. He didn't say it. He sat with his jacket on his knee and his hands loose at his sides, and he listened, and outside the window the February light came and went as the clouds moved, and the violin filled the small room until there was no space left in it for anything but sound. Josephine made pasta. It was the kind of meal that happened without ceremony. A big pot, too much garlic, a jar of sauce augmented with things from the refrigerator in the way of someone who cooked by instinct rather than instruction. She set 3 bowls on the table without being asked whether Nathan was staying, which told him something about Josephine's read on the situation and about the quality of her hospitality, which turned out to be the specific kind that doesn't make a production of itself. Nathan ate and said it was good, which was true, and Josephine accepted this without comment and refilled his bowl without asking, which he also accepted. Clara ate with the focused efficiency of someone who'd been practicing for 3 hours and was running on coffee. And the conversation at the table was not about any of the things that had happened over the past week. It was about Josephine's manuscript, which had reached what she described as a genuinely inconvenient moment in the plot, and about a leak in the bathroom ceiling that the landlord was managing with the specific passive resistance of someone who believed problems resolved themselves if ignored long enough, and about a gray cat named Bernard, who belonged to the downstairs neighbor and had, for reasons no one could establish, decided that Josephine's apartment was his actual home. Bernard himself appeared halfway through the meal, materializing from somewhere in the back of the apartment with the absolute confidence of a creature who has never questioned his welcome anywhere. Nathan watched Clara reach down and scratch Bernard behind the ears without thinking about it, and he watched Bernard accept this as his due, and he thought, this is the version of her that exists outside of everything I've seen. This is the version that was here the whole time, underneath the uniform and the careful composure and the 4 minutes and 20 seconds of Bach that dismantled a room full of people who should have known better. He drove back to New York that evening. Clara walked him to his car, and they stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the cold with the streetlight making everything look more significant than it probably was. The residency, he said, at the conservatory. What does that look like? Preliminary, she said. Mrs. Vasarhelyi made a call. Someone there wants to hear me play before anything is decided. It could be nothing. It won't be nothing. She looked at him. You don't know that. I know enough. She shoved her hands in her coat pockets. Nathan, I need to do this part on my own. Whatever happens with the conservatory, whatever happens with the career, I need to know that I built it, not that someone with your kind of connections cleared a path. I know, he said. And he did know. He'd known it since the party, since she'd handed his mother's violin back and said she needed to finish her shift. She had always been the person who finished her shift. I'm not going to make calls. I'm going to sit in the audience and watch you play. Those are different things. She considered him for a moment. They are different things, she agreed. He got in the car. She was still standing on the sidewalk when he pulled away, hands in her pockets, coat slightly too big at the shoulders, watching him go with the expression of someone who has made a decision and is standing behind it, even if they're not entirely sure yet what the decision was. He drove home thinking about his mother. He thought about that specific memory. 10 years old, top of the stairs, listening to the chaconne rise through the floorboards, and he thought about the particular shape of grief, how it doesn't diminish so much as it changes form, how it moves from the sharp thing it is at the beginning into something more architectural, something that becomes part of the structure of how you live rather than a wound that sits on top of it. He thought about Elaine, about the 18 months she'd had with Lily before the aneurysm, about the way he'd spent years carrying the weight of being two people when he was only built to be one. He didn't think any of this was resolved. He didn't think he was fixed, or that Clara was, or that the thing between them was going to be uncomplicated because they'd had an honest conversation in a practice room in Somerville. He'd made that mistake before. The mistake of thinking that a moment of clarity meant the hard work was finished. It was never finished. That was the thing nobody told you, or everybody told you, and you didn't hear it until you lived it. The hard work was never finished. It just became, gradually, more familiar. He got home at 11. The house was quiet. Mrs. Gaines, the housekeeper who stayed with Lily in the evenings, had left the kitchen light on. He went upstairs and looked in on Lily, who was asleep with her chess problem folded on the nightstand and her mother's photograph visible from the door. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She stirred the way she sometimes did when he checked on her. Her eyes opened halfway. Dad? Yeah, go back to sleep. A pause. Did you fix it? He looked at his daughter, 7 years old, in the process of reading a chess book that had mistakes in it that she'd already found, dark eyes that asked real questions. I started to, he said. She nodded, the same single nod she used when information had been received and processed. Okay, she said, and closed her eyes. He pulled her door almost closed and went to bed. The spring came slowly, as springs in New York do, grudgingly, in fits, warm days followed by cold ones that seemed to be making a point about not being rushed. Clara came back to the city in March, not to the estate, and not to Brooklyn, but to a sublet in Washington Heights, that a colleague of Mrs. Vasarhelyi's made available at a reasonable rate. It was smaller than her Brooklyn apartment, with better light and worse plumbing, and she was fine with both of those things. The audition at the New England Conservatory had happened in mid-February, 10 days after Nathan's visit to Somerville. She had played for 45 minutes in front of a panel of 3 faculty members and the conservatory's artist-in-residence coordinator, in a room with better acoustics than anything she'd played in since Juilliard. She played the Bartók Second Movement, a Prokofiev sonata she'd been working on with Mrs. Vasarhelyi, and, at the coordinator's request, after the formal program, the chaconne. She found out 2 weeks later that she'd been offered a 6-month artist residency beginning in September. She called Mrs. Vasarhelyi first. The old woman said, "Of course they offered it. Did you play well?" "Yes," Clara said. "Then of course they offered it." A pause. "You sound surprised." "I'm not surprised," Clara said. I don't know what I am." "You're allowed to be pleased, Clara. It's not a character flaw." She called Nathan second. He answered on the first ring, which she noticed, and said, "Tell me," before she'd finished her first sentence, which made her smile in a way she was glad he couldn't see. She told him. He was quiet for a long enough moment that she thought the connection had dropped. Then, "Your father would have thought that was the best thing he'd heard all week." She stood in her Washington Heights sublet with its good light and its bad plumbing and felt something move through her chest that she didn't try to name. "Yeah," she said, "he would have." The months between February and September had their own texture. She was in the city, then visiting the estate, then in the city again. The rhythm of it settled into something that was neither entirely separate nor entirely merged, which was the closest she could get to what she needed. She needed to keep the thread of her own life clearly in her hands. She needed to know it was hers. But she also needed, and this was harder to admit, not because she was ashamed of it, but because she'd spent so long not needing anything that the admission required a kind of recalibration. She needed what was growing in that house in Westchester. She needed Lily's chess problems, and Nathan's level voice, and the library in the afternoon light, and the specific feeling of being in a space where someone was genuinely glad she was there. Those two things, she was learning, could coexist. That was the actual lesson of the past year, if she had to name one. That protecting yourself and allowing yourself to belong somewhere were not the same as each other and did not have to cancel each other out. She had spent 11 years making them synonymous, making safety mean solitude, making strength mean needing nothing. It was a reasonable response to loss. It was also, she could see now from a slight distance, a kind of ongoing deprivation that she'd dressed up as independence. Her father had not been an island. He'd worked 2 jobs and come to every recital in his good shirt and asked her, on the last Sunday she'd spent with him before he died, whether she was happy at Juilliard, not whether she was performing well or developing correctly or on track, whether she was happy. She'd said yes, and she'd meant it, and he'd squinted into the sun and said, "Good. That's the only thing that matters." She'd spent 11 years making it not matter, and then wondering why things felt hollow. Nathan, for his part, was doing his own recalibrating. He'd had a conversation with his therapist, a man named Dr. Osei, who he'd been seeing irregularly for 3 years, and who received information with the calm non-reaction of someone who had heard most things, about the night of the birthday party, and what had possessed him to do what he'd done. Dr. Osei had made one observation, offered without emphasis. "You'd been keeping that cabinet closed for 2.5 years. Something made you open it in front of 200 people. That's worth sitting with." Nathan had sat with it. What he came to, slowly and without the dramatic clarity he'd have preferred, was something like this. He had been for 8 years the reliable one, the one who held things together, the one who managed. He'd built a company and raised a daughter and maintained a house and a reputation and a social presence, and he had done all of it competently, and in the process he had reduced himself to a function. He was Nathan Holloway, the real estate developer. He was Lily's father. He was the composed man at the head of the table. He had stopped being someone who could be surprised by his own impulses. And then a woman he didn't know had been standing in his ballroom with an empty tray and rosin-rough fingers and something in her face that was completely unperformable, and he had opened a cabinet he hadn't opened in 2.5 years without entirely knowing why. And it had felt, for the first time in a long time, like doing something true. The failure afterward, the doubt, the silence, the 48 hours that Clara had been exactly right about, came from the same place as the cabinet keeping, the reflex to manage, the default to protection. He had looked at a situation that required trust and chosen management instead, and it had cost him something real, and the only way through it was to be different, not fixed, not resolved, different, gradually, through the accumulation of better choices. He was working on it. It was slow. That was honest. In April, on a Saturday when the weather had finally committed to being spring, Nathan took Lily to a performance at Carnegie Hall. A young violinist from South Korea making her American debut, 23 years old, a player who had apparently been described by the Times in terms that set expectations high. Lily sat in the seat beside him with her program in her lap and her feet not quite reaching the floor, dressed in a way that she had selected herself and that involved a velvet headband and opinions. The violinist came out and the audience applauded, and Lily studied the stage with the focused attention she brought to everything. Halfway through the first piece, Lily leaned over and said quietly into Nathan's ear, "She's good, but she doesn't sound like Clara." Nathan looked at his daughter. "Clara sounds like she means it more," Lily said, with the decisive finality of someone who has rendered a verdict and is not taking questions. She turned back to the stage. Nathan looked at the stage too and thought about September and felt something settle in his chest. Not the ache of the past years, not the management of it, but something quieter, something that felt like anticipation, which was an emotion he'd almost forgotten he was capable of. The concert announcement went out in July. Clara Brooks, it said, in the clean sans serif font of the New England Conservatory's communications. Violin. Residency debut performance, September 14th. Jordan Hall, Boston. Beneath that, the program. Prokofiev, Bartók, and closing the evening, Bach, Partita No. 2 in D minor. Mrs. Wasserhay called Clara when she saw the program. "The chaconne to close," she said. "That's a statement." "I know," Clara said. "You're sure you're ready for it?" Clara thought about the practice room in Somerville. She thought about the ballroom in November. She thought about the first time she'd played it in her apartment after 11 years, alone on the edge of her bed with the traffic outside and the radiator knocking, the way it had felt like a door on a hinge that had been stuck for a long time. "I've been ready," she said. "I just needed to stop pretending I wasn't." The logistics of getting Nathan and Lily to Boston for September 14th involved more coordination than either of them would have predicted, largely because Lily had decided she needed a specific outfit and had opinions about what that outfit should communicate. "Serious but not sad," she explained, which Nathan conveyed to the store with a straight face. And because Nathan had meetings that ran long in the week before and had to be restructured around a commitment he'd made clear was not negotiable. They drove up on the morning of the 14th. Lily sat in the back seat with a book, which she read for 40 minutes and then sat down and looked out the window for the rest of the drive, thinking something she didn't share. Nathan drove and drank his travel coffee and let the radio play low and didn't try to fill the silence, which was one of the things he'd learned from 7 years of parenting a child who needed silence the way other people needed conversation. At some point, somewhere on the I-95 corridor, Lily said, "Do you think she's nervous?" "I think she's ready," Nathan said. Lily considered this. "Those aren't the same thing." "No," he said, "they're not." Clara was in fact nervous. She had been in the Jordan Hall green room for 20 minutes before showtime with her violin tuned and her rosin fresh and her hands, which were the part she could not entirely govern, doing the thing they did before performances that she'd had since she was 12, a slight tremor, barely visible, that had nothing to do with technical readiness and everything to do with the specific vulnerability of standing in front of people with an instrument and offering them something true. It didn't go away with experience. Mrs. Wasserhay had told her this at 17 and she'd learned it was accurate. The nervousness didn't mean you weren't ready. It meant you cared about what you were doing. She sat on the bench in the green room and held her violin in her lap and breathed. She thought about her father, not with the specific grief that had lived in that thought for 11 years, but with something older and quieter. The memory of him not as his absence, but as he actually was. Hot dog, afternoon sun, squinting, the laugh. 2 years before the bridge, whether she was happy. She had been. She was going to be. She thought about the ballroom, the laughter that stopped, Nathan's mother's violin under her chin, the way she'd closed her eyes for 1 second and thought about Mrs. Wasserhay's hand on her wrist. "You have it. Don't you dare waste it." She had wasted 11 years. She'd decided, somewhere around February in a practice room in Somerville, that the accounting stopped there. Someone knocked on the green room door. The stage manager. "5 minutes, Ms. Brooks?" "Thank you," she said. She stood. She checked her bow tension. She checked her tuning one more time, the A string, which had a tendency to slip in changes of temperature. It held. She smoothed her dress, which was black and simple and chosen specifically to disappear so that everything that mattered could be what mattered. She thought about Nathan in the audience. She'd seen them arrive. She'd happened to be near a window that looked out onto the hall's entrance and had watched Nathan come through the door with Lily beside him. Lily in her serious but not sad outfit, which had turned out to be a navy dress with a small collar that she had clearly chosen with the same analytical rigor she brought to chess openings. They'd been talking about something. She couldn't see what, just the conversation's body language. Nathan leaning slightly toward Lily, Lily gesturing with one hand, and then Lily had looked up toward the window as though she'd known someone was there, and Clara had stepped back automatically. Though she wasn't sure Lily had actually seen her, she almost certainly had. The stage manager knocked again. Clara picked up her violin and her bow and walked toward the stage. The first thing she noticed when she walked out was the light. Jordan Hall's warm amber stage light, the kind that makes everything look like it matters, like it's been lit for exactly this purpose. The second thing she noticed was the size of the audience, which was larger than she'd expected for a residency debut, and which she understood, after a moment, was partly the result of a single sentence in a Times Arts preview that she'd been pretending not to have read, but had. Clara Brooks, a Juilliard-trained prodigy whose decade-long absence from the concert stage has generated considerable speculation, makes her return this fall. She found the front row without looking like she was looking for it. Nathan was in the third seat from the left. Lily was beside him, program in her lap, chin slightly lifted, the expression of someone paying full attention. When Clara's eyes passed over them in the ordinary sweep of a performer acknowledging the room, Nathan didn't wave or gesture or do anything demonstrative. He just held her gaze for 1 second, and in that second his expression said what it said. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." That was enough. She turned to the audience. She acknowledged the applause with the small bow that she'd been doing since she was 12, and that still felt like her own. Not too deep, not performative. Then she lifted her violin to her shoulder, found the first position, and waited for the room to reach the particular held breath quality that she'd learned was what a concert audience sounds like when it has stopped being a collection of individuals and become one listening thing. It reached it. She played. The Prokofiev first, the Sonata No. 1 in F minor, which was dark and difficult and not a crowd pleaser in the ordinary sense. A piece that asks the audience to stay with it through discomfort before it offers anything like resolution. She chose it deliberately as the opener because she'd decided, somewhere in the months of preparation, that she was not going to curate the evening around what was easiest to receive. She was going to play what was true. People could stay or go. They stayed. She could feel it, the specific quality of sustained attention, the way a room sounds when it's with you rather than waiting for you. The Bartók second, darker still, more complex. The concerto movement she'd been arguing with since January. She'd stopped arguing with it somewhere around April and started inhabiting it, which was the difference between technical mastery and something more. She played the cadenza, the long unaccompanied passage that sat at the center of the movement like a question, with the full weight of everything she'd spent a year rediscovering, and she felt the room shift in the way she'd felt it shift in the ballroom, that particular quality of collective breath held. Intermission. Green room. Water. She sat alone for 12 minutes and did not think about anything important, which was its own kind of discipline. Then, the chaconne. She walked back out to the kind of applause that's slightly different from the applause before intermission. Warmer, more personal, the applause of an audience that has already decided something and is confirming it. She settled herself at center stage, checked her bow one last time, adjusted her shoulder rest a millimeter. Small rituals that were not about doubt, but about presence, about being entirely in the room with what she was about to do. In the third row, Lily Holloway had stopped looking at her program. She was looking at the stage with the absolute focus of a child who has decided this is the most important thing happening anywhere. In the seat beside her, Nathan Holloway had his hands loose in his lap, and his posture the still, settled posture of someone who has arrived somewhere and is staying. He was not thinking about the company or the meetings or the restructured schedule or the conversation he still needed to have about Veronica's final statement. He was thinking about his mother's practice room, the age of 15, the specific grain of the floorboards he'd sat on to listen. He was thinking about a cabinet that had been closed for 2.5 years. He was thinking that some things take exactly as long as they take, and that impatience with that fact is its own kind of loss. Clara raised her bow. The chaconne begins with a chord, 4 strings, forte, a sound that is not delicate or preparatory, but arrives like something that has already been decided. She hit that chord and felt it in her sternum, felt the resonance travel through the instrument into her jaw and her shoulder, felt the room receive it, and understood with a physical certainty that settled below thought. She was back. Not to where she'd been at 21, which was a place she could never return to and didn't need to, but back to herself, to the version of herself that played. She played the chaconne the way she had played it in the ballroom, without holding anything back. But it was different from the ballroom, because she was different. The ballroom had been a rupture, something breaking open that had been sealed. This was something that had healed enough to be whole again, not unmarked, not as if the 11 years hadn't happened, but whole in the way that things that have broken and been repaired are whole, with the repair visible, with the history of the break part of the object's story, which is not a flaw, but a fact. She played the grief in it. Her father, Elaine Holloway, whom she'd never met but had come to know through her daughter's dark eyes and her husband's careful way of carrying loss. She played the love in it, which is not separate from the grief, but woven through it in the way Bach understood and wrote about, and most people spend their lives trying to accept. She played the argument in it, which was the argument she'd been having with herself for 11 years about whether she had the right to want this, whether wanting it was safe, whether safety was the right metric. It was not the right metric. That was the answer she'd arrived at, and she played it. Somewhere in the second variation, Lily leaned very slightly toward Nathan without taking her eyes off the stage, and said, barely above a whisper, "That's what I meant." Nathan looked at his daughter. "That's what I meant," Lily said again, "that she means it more." He looked back at the stage. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the music wasn't already saying. The chaconne runs 15 minutes at full length. Clara played every bar. She didn't manage it or moderate it or hold any part of it back for safety. She played the last variation, the D major passage that arrives near the end like light through a very specific window, unexpected after all the darkness, almost unbearably beautiful in its placement, with the full weight of a person who has earned the right to play it, and who knows it, and who is not pretending otherwise. When she drew the last note out and let the bow come off the strings and the sound dissolve into the hall, the silence that followed lasted 4 full seconds. Then Jordan Hall stood up. Not politely, not in the practiced way of an audience that knows it's supposed to respond to certain markers, the way people stand when something has happened to them that they didn't plan on. The front rows first, then the middle, then the back, a wave moving through the hall like something physical, and the sound of it, the particular full-throated sound of an audience on its feet, filled the space where the chaconne had been. Clara stood at center stage and absorbed it. She did not cry. She had cried in the green room before the show, briefly, which she would not have told anyone but would not have denied. On stage she stood in the amber light with her violin at her side and her bow in her hand, and felt the applause land on her like something she had not known she was hungry for until it arrived. Not the validation of it, not the external confirmation, but the specific communion of it, the fact of a room full of people who had received what she'd offered and were sending something back. She bowed. She bowed again. Someone in the third row shouted "Bravo" in a voice that was slightly ragged, which was the best kind of bravo. She looked at the front row. Lily Holloway was standing on the seat of her chair, which she had apparently decided was the appropriate response to the situation. Her navy dress with the small collar and her velvet headband and her hands clapping with the total uninhibited energy of a 7-year-old who has no investment in looking composed. Beside her, Nathan was standing too, not clapping yet, just looking at the stage, looking at Clara. And his face had the expression she'd first seen in the ballroom in November, the one that had nothing polished about it, nothing managed. The one that looked like a man who has been caught off guard by his own capacity for feeling and has decided this time not to do anything about it. She held his gaze across the distance of the hall for one moment. Just one. Then she bowed again because the audience was still on its feet, and she had learned tonight that she was not someone who walked away from this anymore. They found each other afterward in the lobby because Jordan Hall's lobby was where the post-concert crowd gathered and where the green room led out. And because Lily had apparently decided that waiting for Clara to emerge was not an option and had stationed herself near the green room door with the strategic patience of someone who had read about the Sicilian defense and understood positioning. When Clara came out, Lily did not run because running was not her style. She walked quickly, which for Lily was equivalent, and arrived in front of Clara and stopped. "You played the chaconne better than the recording my dad showed me," Lily said. Clara looked down at her. "That's a generous thing to say." "It's accurate," Lily said. "I pay attention to these things." Clara crouched down so she was at eye level with Lily, which put her face very close to the velvet headband. "I know you do," she said. "I've been counting on it." Something in Lily's expression shifted, the assessment relaxing into something more open, something that didn't have a name in a 7-year-old's vocabulary, but that Clara recognized because she'd felt it herself in that practice room in Somerville, in the kitchen in Brooklyn, in the library, in the afternoon light. It was the feeling of something being safe. Lily put her arms around Clara's neck, which was not a thing she did casually. Nathan had told Clara that Lily reserved physical affection with the deliberateness of someone distributing a limited resource. Clara put her arms around Lily and held on, and felt the small, solid weight of her, and didn't say anything because there was nothing that needed saying. Nathan was standing a few feet back, giving them the moment. When Clara stood and looked at him, he was holding his jacket over one arm and his program in the other hand, and he looked exactly like what he was. A man in a concert hall lobby who was tired and who had driven 4 hours, and whose daughter was currently adjusting her velvet headband with the satisfaction of someone who has accomplished what she set out to accomplish. "She was right," Clara said to him. "The Sicilian defense analogy. Those are two different things." He understood what she was referring to. "She's right about most things." "It's exhausting," Clara said. "Constantly," he agreed. They stood in the lobby while the crowd moved around them, while people who had heard her play came and introduced themselves and said the things people say after a performance that means something, and Clara received it all with the warmth of someone who is genuinely present, genuinely there. No part of her was in the room with the door locked. Grace had said she was less sealed back in December, and she was less sealed now than she'd been then, and she intended to keep going in that direction. There was a dinner. The conservatory coordinator had organized something for the residency artists and a few faculty members at a restaurant in the Back Bay, and Clara had been invited and had said yes. She asked Nathan and Lily if they wanted to come, which was perhaps not protocol, but was exactly what she wanted, and Nathan said yes, and Lily said obviously, which settled that. They walked out of Jordan Hall into the September evening, which was the good kind of September. Cool enough for a coat, but not cold, the kind of night that smells like the end of summer deciding to let go gracefully. The streets outside the hall were lit and busy, people moving in both directions, the city doing what cities do, indifferent and full of life. Lily walked between them. At some point, and neither Nathan nor Clara registered exactly when it happened, she took both their hands, one on each side, with the matter-of-fact grip of a child who has decided that this is how this goes, and is not making an announcement about it. They walked like that for half a block before Nathan said, to no one in particular and to Clara specifically, "She's going to tell the chess book's author about his mistake eventually. I want you to be prepared for that." "I've been mentally preparing," Clara said. "She's written a letter," he said. "A draft. She's on the 4th revision." "That's extremely Lily." "It really is." Lily, between them, did not confirm or deny any of this. She walked with the composure of a person who is above the conversation while being entirely aware of it. The restaurant was warm and full of noise, the good kind of noise. Overlapping conversations, the clatter of a kitchen in full operation, the specific energy of a room where people are celebrating something. Clara sat at the long table with her residency colleagues and the faculty and Nathan and Lily, and she ate and she talked and she laughed at something the conservatory coordinator said that was genuinely funny, and she felt, sitting there, the particular rare quality of being exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because it was perfect. The wine was slightly too warm and the service was slow, and Lily fell asleep in her chair before the dessert course with her head resting on Nathan's arm and her mouth slightly open in a way she would have found undignified if she'd been awake to know about it. Nathan's shoulder was at an angle that was probably uncomfortable, and he didn't move because he didn't want to wake her, which Clara noticed and did not comment on. The conversation at the table went in the way of dinners that have too many people, in fragments, in interruptions, in threads that started and got lost and surfaced again 20 minutes later. None of it was smooth. All of it was real. After, in the parking lot, while Nathan was settling a sleeping Lily into the back seat with the particular practiced quiet of someone who has done this 1,000 times, Clara stood by the car and looked up at the sky, which was doing its September thing. More stars than the city usually allowed, the air clear enough to make it possible. She thought about a practice room with bad fluorescent lighting. She thought about a radiator that knocked. She thought about a first-floor apartment in Queens and a Sunday in the park and the specific sound of a chaconne rising through the floorboards of a house where a 10-year-old sat at the top of the stairs and listened. She thought about all the things that had to break in exactly the right ways to make tonight possible. Her father's death, which she would never stop grieving and would never stop carrying, and which had led her to stop. And stopping had made the starting again mean something entirely different than it would have meant at 21. Nathan's loss, which had led him to lock a cabinet, which he'd opened for reasons neither of them fully understood, in a room full of people who laughed at the wrong moment and stopped laughing when the music started. Lily, who had walked into a library and sat in an armchair and asked real questions and decided, with the sovereign certainty of a 7-year-old who pays attention to things, that Clara was someone worth positioning for. None of it had been planned. Very little of it had been manageable. All of it had been real. Nathan straightened up from the back seat and closed the door carefully. He stood beside her and looked up at the sky too, briefly, then looked at her. "Ready?" he said. She thought about what the word meant. She'd been asking herself that for a year, in various forms. Ready to play, ready to trust, ready to want something, ready to stop treating her own life like a thing to be survived rather than lived. The answer kept being the same answer, the one her father had given her without knowing it, standing in a park squinting into the sun with a hot dog in his hand. The only thing that matters is whether you're happy. She was getting there. Those were the same thing. "Yes," she said. They drove back through the September night, the highway unspooling in the headlights, Lily asleep in the back with her velvet headband slightly crooked and her chest problem somehow retrieved from somewhere and held loosely in one hand even in sleep, because some habits are too fundamental to set down entirely. Clara had her father's violin on her lap in its case. Not the student instrument, not Margaret Holloway's instrument, her father's. The one that had come back to her from a shop in the East Village through the particular chain of events that happens when someone pays enough attention to look for a thing. She rested her hand on the case and felt the familiar weight of it and thought, here. This is what here feels like. It was not the end of difficulty. There were still things to build. Her career, which was beginning again from a new starting point with all the work that implied. Whatever she and Nathan were building, which was real and imperfect and still in the early stages of declaring itself. Lily growing up, which was going to be extraordinary and exhausting and the kind of thing nobody is actually ready for. The ordinary accumulation of days that would be good and bad and mostly somewhere in between, which was what a life was. But she had her father's violin in her lap, and a 7-year-old with a chess problem asleep in the back seat, and a man beside her who had made a mistake and known it and driven to Boston to say so in person, which was not everything but was something real. It was the kind of real you could build on, the kind that didn't ask you to be something you weren't, only to be more fully what you already were. Outside, the September night moved past. The highway lights appeared and disappeared. The stars, where they were visible, held their positions with the indifferent permanence of things that predate all human trouble and will outlast it. In the back seat, in her sleep, Lily's grip on the chess problem tightened slightly, as if she'd arrived at a solution and intended to hold it. Clara looked at the road ahead. She did not look back.